Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Lewis. I'm the Stevie Star Transnational China Fellow here at the Baker Institute, head of our China Studies program. I'm also a faculty member in Asian Studies, and very happy to have you join us for our first, one hopes, post-pandemic panel. We're very, very happy to return to these. In fact, if you look at the title of the event, Political Reform in China, we've been doing this for the last decade. This is actually our 9th panel. And maybe the title Political Reform in China is even more fraught than most years. But the reason we came up with the title about a decade ago was because this was when Xi Jinping was just coming into power, and it was immediately people were questioning, where are reforms going to go with a man in charge who doesn't seem to be a reformer naturally at heart? And so it seems like this year we should be continuing to discuss this. The timing, I have to say, I'm going to pat myself on the back here, turned out to be really good because we called this back in May. We signed up and say, when is the party Congress going to be? Chinese government party don't release this information usually until like the month and a half before. So we said, you know what, I bet it's going to be around the middle of October. So darn it, perfect. We hit basically the second day of the party Congress is going on in Beijing. So this is an excellent time to get together to talk about that. Our format is pretty simple. We've been bringing together experts mainly from all over Texas, sometimes from outside of Texas, to share their research and give us some insight into what's happening with politics in general, but also reform in general in China. And the format will be basically, we've asked each one of our presenters to speak for about 25 minutes, maybe 30 minutes at most. Please hold your questions until all three of us are done. And by way of introduction, I can say Dr. Carrie Leo Courier from Texas Christian will start us off. She's going to be talking about civil society in China. So we're going to start off talking about the people. Then Brandon Zhang from our China Studies program will be talking about changes in propaganda. So he'll be talking about the message. I'll be the last presenter, and I'll be talking about Xi Jinping and his rise to power, what's unique about him. So I'll be talking about the man. So from the people to the message to the man, and hopefully we'll cover most of our bases. That format then is we'll open it up for hopefully about a half hour, of Q&A, followed by refreshments outside. Please join us where we can kind of speak more informally. And so please hold your questions until after all of the presenters are done, but we look forward to hearing them and to hearing what thoughts you have and what questions you have and how we might be helpful in interpreting all that's going on. Let me invite our first speaker, Dr. Carrie Leo Courier, who is not a stranger to these events. This is her third one. I think the last one was 2019 when she came down and shared her insights. She is a professor of political science at Texas Christian University. Like myself, an avowed sinologist, a student of Chinese politics, a comparative politics scholar. She has any number of research projects going on, in addition to being department chair. So being very, very busy, playing a role as an institutional leader at Texas Christian, as they're going about expanding, much like we are here at Rice. But in addition, multiple research projects. And this happens to be her presentation relating to one of the ones she's most interested in right now. I'm on civil society and things like protest movements and social movements. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Courier.
Thank you for coming out on a Monday afternoon. And thank you, Steve, for inviting me here. I always love coming down here and getting to talk about China, and it is very timely. So today I'm going to be talking about authoritarianism 2.0, the adaptability of the Chinese state. This is part of a research project that I've been working on with one of my former students, Jonathan Turner, who's a graduate student at Arizona State, and looking at how authoritarian regimes manage to survive in an age when we have a lot of pressures from below to engage in more democracy. Let me see, I'm going to try this. Oh, yes. So right now, of course, many of you probably paid attention to the Party Congress opening speech by Xi Jinping. I'm sure you all paid attention to the full 2 hours of the speech and read through the 63 pages of the translation. There are a lot of interesting things about the opening ceremony and about the opening speech. There are many lessons that we can learn. One of the things that China watchers like to do is pore through how many times certain phrases are repeated, what new phrases we start to see, who's in attendance and who's not in attendance, and really a lot of attention is paid to both the words and the audience to determine what kind of messages we can kind of glean from what we're starting to see. And particularly since there is, full anticipation that Xi Jinping is going to be with us for quite some time, not having those term limits in place. So when we look at some lessons from Xi's speech, for those of you who did pore through it, there are a couple of things to look at. One, of course, is that there's a lot of emphasis on national security. The three of us aren't going to be explicitly discussing the external foreign policy factors, but are happy to entertain some of those questions when we get to the Q&A session. But national security is more than just about external threats. It's also looking at internal threats. So getting a sense in how the Chinese determine what national security actually means and those threats to the state. One of the things that we also see in the speech is that there's a little bit less emphasis on the economy and reform. You can see why that would be the case, particularly given some of the challenges that the COVID lockdowns have created for the Chinese economy. And one of the things that we often talk about as China watchers is how important it is that the economy keep growing and maintaining itself as part of a way that we see legitimacy of the state. So it's interesting to see less emphasis being placed on the economy. In addition, of course, we try to figure out who's there and who's not there. Noticeably missing was Jiang Zemin, and also looking at who is there. If you look at the bottom picture, I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but in the middle is Zhang Gali, who is who is the senior party official who is part of the Peng Shuai scandal that I'm going to discuss later in talking about feminist movement. So senior party leader who was accused by the tennis player of sexual assault. And so what's interesting is that he was visible and noticeable in the front row at the Party Congress. So all these things, are ways that we start to pay attention to what's going on so we can kind of get some messages in terms of what we can look for moving forward. The 20th Party Congress also shows us how authoritarian regimes work. And so one of the things I think is useful, so some of you are China watchers in particular, and some of you may just be interested in learning more about authoritarian regimes in China as one element as one case to that study. And so when we look at what the 20th Party Congress shows us, we can see the ways that even just the Congress itself demonstrates elements of the authoritarian state with the security measures that were put in place leading up to the actual Congress, and looking at the lockdown measures to ensure that there is a sanitized city. And by sanitized, meaning that you don't have threats that emerge that could potentially bring shame or that would raise concern. Now, with one exception, which is that if you were paying attention on the 13th, there was the protest over some of the COVID lockdowns and the banner that was placed up. But overall, there is a massive effort to try to control the environment in order to create the cleanest situation possible to focus on just the party message and not look at any other distractions. So all of these things tell us a little bit about how authoritarian states work. What I'm going to talk about today is to look a little bit at this project that I've been working on in terms of challenges to civil society. So Steve mentioned that I was here 3 years ago and I talked about potential threats and the growth of civil society. I'm sure you were all there at that talk 3 years ago. But if you weren't, the 30-second version of the 25-minute talk is that there are many ways that civil society is starting to grow. And so the question is, how many challenges are we going to possibly see to the state if civil society is allowed to thrive? And by thriving, I don't mean in the sense of a Western thriving of civil society. So we're looking at it in relative terms, that there are ways that we see pressures from below that are starting to emerge. And then in that talk, I also mentioned some of the areas that were of interest, 3 of which I'm going to talk about today. So basically, it's an update to where we were and how we can measure various elements of success. So the questions that I have is, how long can an authoritarian state withstand the test of civil society? And this is a question, again, that we ask ourselves about a number of different countries, and China just being one of them. In addition, we have to look at how the tools of repression and co-optation have changed. And so authoritarian regimes do have to adapt as our needs adapt. And so we'll see different ways that access to the internet, the globalization of the economy, the ways that we see increased travel and information dissemination have forced authoritarian regimes to make adjustments to how they do business and how they stay in power. And the third thing is to look at how do we measure citizen activism and the success of citizen action. So if we think about it from only a Western context, you might say, well, success would be if you can overthrow the regime and implement a democracy. And that's a bit extreme when we think of how do we measure elements of citizen success. So I have a framework that I'm going to talk about that gives us some ways that we can start to measure success to see what are the factors that need to be in existence for activism to be successful. So essentially, the questions are, how have authoritarian regimes like China adapted to pressures from below? And what I'm going to do is look at a case study of 3 different types of citizen activism: labor movements, environmental movements, and feminist movements. So looking at those 3 different types of cases will give us a sense of where we see things going and how the state is trying to adapt to those pressures from below. So authoritarian resilience is how we often talk about, again, this trend that we're seeing in that authoritarian regimes are facing pressure from below, but they manage to adapt in certain ways to still stay in power. So if I give you the brief background, I'm not going to go through all of these color revolutions, but you can see here I have a list of various, we call color revolutions, which are different efforts in various states to remove authoritarian regimes or place pressure from below and to have democracy. And in each of these cases, we've seen success in terms of being able to change authoritarian regimes. Now, of these different color movements, the things that we see that unite them and make for commonalities is often they are tied to economic crises that are occurring. They are linked to deteriorating social conditions, and that there are elements of corruption that are of concern. And so if we think about that in the Chinese context, economic crises, challenges to the economy, deteriorating social conditions for various groups, and then look at Xi Jinping's attack on corruption, you can see that there are elements that are, of course, of concern for the Chinese in looking at these common characteristics that show successful color revolutions could be a threat. And there have been fears, not just in China, but among other states that have those same kinds of conditions, that there could be contagion, particularly after the Jasmine Revolution, when we did see democracy start to infiltrate through Northern Africa into the Middle East. Now, the question is, how do authoritarian regimes adapt? And when we look at these different characteristics, these are things that we see, again, across a number of states. I'm going to add in little bits about China in particular as well and explain some of these concepts. So one of the things, of course, are restrictions on citizen organization. And last time I was here, I talked a little bit about the ways that citizen organization is very difficult in the Chinese context. So the challenges that exist and the barriers that exist to creating organizations include things like having to have a permanent office space, having a minimum amount of funds available, having sponsorship by a parent organization. So those things are often different kinds of barriers to decrease the likelihood that organizations independent of the state can exist. In addition, of course, we see that surveillance has improved. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Chinese surveillance state, but it's no surprise that there has been a great deal of investment in ways that you can track individuals, follow individuals, and that's true for a variety of authoritarian regimes. And so with the improvements in surveillance, that's also caused states to have to make adjustments. The third thing that we can see is that when we used to think about authoritarian regimes, and I know I keep saying authoritarian regimes a lot, I'm going to trip over it a few times, I'm sure. But when we used to look at authoritarian regimes, we'd focus a lot on repression, so the use of force in order to co-opt various interests. And what we've seen is that there have been changes in the use of force. So in the past, we'd look at repression to co-opt interests as sort of a commonality. And now we're looking at how there have been changes from indiscriminate repression to discriminate repression. What that means is that the average person isn't necessarily going to feel a police state, right? Doesn't feel like they're likely to be targeted. It's individuals that may fall into certain kinds of categories or that engage in certain kinds of behavior that would know that they are in a group that would be of threat. And so that's the shift from using indiscriminate repression to discriminate repression. The fourth item on here are challenges of information control. And we think about all of the challenges of information control. We can again see the prevalence of the internet. Cell phones have changed how we are able to control information. It used to be if you were taking pictures in the wrong place, somebody would come over, open up your camera with film. Yes, some of us remember cameras with film, and take the film out so you would lose those photos. Now with cell phones and with digital photography, it makes it a little bit more of a challenge because you can get information out and past sensors in ways that you couldn't before. So the challenges of information control today include that, as well as having an enormous number of eyes on the state. So you can see that with more foreigners traveling, that creates a whole different dilemma in terms of being able to truly sanitize and control information from getting in or out. The fifth item to look at are ways that we have to rethink what censorship means. So again, if we think of the old tools, censorship could be simply blocking sites, right? So especially when we're thinking about the internet today. So when you look for something, you look for Tiananmen Square, Tank Man, and you're going to see Tiananmen Square. Maybe you'll see a picture of a kite, but you're not going to see Tank Man in terms of looking at what's available. Censorship's gotten a lot more complex. And so there are different ways that you don't even realize that information is being weeded out or more difficult to find. So if you should be able to find something and the site says this is blocked, that might trigger a response in you that says, well, I want to find out more about this. Why is it blocked? But other tactics such as friction and flooding can also be used to make information difficult to find. Friction basically increases the information cost to individuals. So what that means is if you go looking for something and your search history or your search engine brings up 1,000 choices, it's buried somewhere in 998. So who's going to make it through all of those different options to get to and find the information that you're looking for? So something very simple as pushing information further down into a search is one way that you can create friction and make the information costs much higher. Another thing that you can do in order to create friction is that you, instead of just looking at flooding or trying to shift information further, you can also slow down web pages. How many of you have tried to load a web page? It's not loading, you hit refresh, you hit refresh, you hit refresh, and then you just give up, right? Can't possibly be that important. You'll look for something else that has the same information. And so those are different tricky ways that authoritarian regimes have been known to try to make information costs much higher. Flooding is a little bit different in that with flooding, you can try to diffuse the negative information with other information. So let's say that there is a protest about an environmental movement and you don't want that information to be seen. You can try any of those other strategies, you can try to block it, but another thing that you can do is you can flood the internet or flood your news sources with positive information about something similar so that it offsets the negative information that is there. So flooding then diffuses the negative component with a positive component. And that's another way that can be utilized where you don't realize that the information is part of a propaganda machine or ways that you're being filtered out from receiving the information that you're looking for. Another reason why we see the information or why we see the internet and technology being used in different ways is that the internet can serve as a feedback mechanism. So certain elements of protest and negative information can get out so the state knows what's going on, right? So it can find out where there could be potential problems and challenges in the future. And so there are reasons to allow information to get out, to have that feedback mechanism, and in some ways the state can be responsive in order to offset some of the negative components. So these are some of the different ways that authoritarian regimes are adapting to the changes that we see today, and the effect is basically to help diffuse protest and also to remain in power. Right, so in order to avoid there from becoming so much pressure that it would want to overturn the authority of the state. So all of this is part of understanding what authoritarian resilience is. If we look at how the Chinese state adapts, I'll have to explain the pictures in a moment, but what the Chinese state has created is a very powerful security apparatus, and I'm sure I don't have to tell this crowd anything about that, right? So we all have spent a lot of time looking at the importance of cameras or how many cameras have been installed, the surveillance state, the use of artificial intelligence. All of these are various ways that the state has created a unique security apparatus. Any hint of criticism is often shut down. So in the pictures here, these are actually pictures from my cell phone. The pictures on the left, the reason why the first one has a text from my mom in it is because I was taking pictures and then I was so paranoid that I screenshotted it and was sending it to her and deleting them. And so a text from her came in at the same time as I was sending her these pictures. So we were standing there in front of a Shanghai municipal office. I was there with students, and this woman walks up to the pole, and she has a little sign up, and you can't see it really well, but it says, you know, impossible idea, or is this the legitimate rights? And I don't know what she was protesting about, but she walked up there. We saw it happening. I was taking pictures, and then all of a sudden we saw the authorities come through, and then she went away. So very innocuous, one individual, right, got her message out, moved on, but my paranoia leads me to start texting, screenshotting, and deleting it from my phone because I was worried about what might happen. The other picture in the bottom right is a picture I took of the flag raising ceremony in Tiananmen Square. And so it's actually a video. I don't think I can play the video, but we're standing there, and what you can see in front of me are all the cell phones. We're all getting ready to take a video or pictures of the flag raising ceremony itself. And so a protester comes through, starts screaming. I couldn't hear what it was. And then the police, you know, the security forces descend and then drag the individual off. These are examples of things you can't easily sanitize when you have, 5,000 people in the audience with cell phone cameras that are ready to take note of what's going on. And so the point of raising this is that even small efforts at protest are often shut down, of course, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the larger ones. The national security laws then are there to protect the state. So the important thing to think about when we think about how the Chinese state is adapting, it's creating this important security apparatus, it's shutting down criticism, and all of this is under the guise of protecting the state. And what protecting the state means is protecting the party, protecting the current regime, and of course protecting Xi Jinping. A little quick debrief on civil society. So if we want to look at what the civil society context is, civil society is the ability to organize outside of the interests of the state/party. So it's the ability to basically formulate independent organizations around various interests. One of the things that I mentioned already is that we have seen an increase in civil society, and again, increase is relative. But one of the things that we have started to see more is that visible protest is allowed to occur. So again, if we think back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was more difficult to find news about labor strikes or about environmental protests. And so now we're finding this information is more readily available. And again, we've seen that there has been independent organizations that have been allowed to exist. There are still a lot of challenges for NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and government-organized NGOs, which are gongos. What I want to point you to is the last bit, is that if we start looking at the kinds of activism that has been able to gain traction over the last 10 years, what are the characteristics and features that we can look at that tell us when and why we're able to see certain amounts of protest visible in society? There are three things to look at. One, of course, is that there is no challenge to state authority or legitimacy. So when you're looking at the types of protests that have gained traction, that have become visible, these are not protests that are challenging the authority of the state, challenging Xi Jinping. Those are not going to gain a lot of traction. The second thing is that you have very public and localized issues. So again, if we're looking at the difference, localized versus national issues, it's the local issues that manage to gain a little bit more traction than others. And the third is that it's policy oriented. So when you're looking at localized protests on a specific policy that doesn't challenge the state, those are the kinds of things that we see. We don't see that other type of variety. So I'm going to give you a little framework in terms of looking at how we measure success. It's a little academic, so I'm going to try and make it a little bit more interesting. So in this, what we do is we start looking at these different authors who have written about how we can start looking at different kinds of policy and how we measure success. So if I can summarize the boxes on the left, Kingdon's work looks at successful problem solving. And in this, the reason I point these out is I'm going to show you what this framework looks like and how you can plug cases into it. So there's a problem stream, basically identifying if something is urgent or important. You look at whether or not there are viable proposals that are being put forth, and so whether you can see very clear, concrete measures that would identify important solutions. And the third component is a little bit fuzzier to start to look at, and that's getting a sense of what the political climate is. So what the national mood is, if there are administration changes, if there's international pressure, right? So basically anything that tells us about that surrounding political environment. That framework can then be used to apply to different cases to understand, again, whether we see success. The second type over on the right-hand side is by Ripley and Franklin, and these are different policy types. And so you're going to see this applied to environmental movements and labor movements in terms of looking at what is the policy that it's looking at. Are they protective regulatory, meaning that you're looking at trying to protect damage to a public good, or is it redistributive in terms of reallocating a good or opportunity? And when you take these two pieces together, it'll give us a sense of when citizen action is permitted. And this could be extended beyond the Chinese case. In addition, we have to think about what constitutes success. So the goal, especially in social science, is to try to identify, clarify, measure things, and then test whether or not it's accurate. So the different kinds of success that we see include things like accommodation, collaboration, and compromise. And this is more relevant when you start getting into the details of specific cases. The framework then, and this is Jonathan Turner from Arizona State, which is my student, has put together those areas into this policy framework. So the policy context, the problem stream, the policy stream, and the politics stream, and then the policy types of protective regulatory versus redistributive. And there are a number of other things that go into these boxes, but for the focus of time, I'm not going to spend any time dealing with looking at organized leadership and other components. But basically, what's the scope and intensity of the problem? What are the goals of citizen action? And what are the government priorities? So the three areas that I see as challenges, these emerging challenges, particularly for China, include labor movements, environmental activism, and feminist activism. And these are three that I identified last time I was here. What I want to do is give us an update in terms of looking at cases over time and seeing what that actually means. So with labor activism, and I'm going to go through some of the cases, I'm not going to go through all of the cases, but I wanted to give you a sense of what it looks like. I actually have a larger database that has hundreds of cases in these different areas. Labor activism, I'm going to show you the China labor strike map. The labor strike map's a nice way to look at a continual cataloging of various labor strikes, and you might be surprised to see the number of ones that we're seeing today. In our study, we also have various case studies. So there's the Zhongshan lock factory, a coal protest, and a taxi protest. In each of these labor examples, often the issues have to deal with wage compensation, are dealing with some of the structural components of a local employment situation. But we are looking at different cases that gain more traction. So we're not looking at places that have a protest with 10 people. We're looking at larger cases, right? Those that in particular that start to grow and could possibly pose a threat to the state. The second grouping is environmental activism, and so you can see here power plants, smelting plants, chemical protests, processing plants, garbage incineration plants. Many of those, of course, are then tied to pollution effects in some of those local areas. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the copper smelting plant, so you have a little bit of context. The third category is feminist activism. And what I'm going to do is use the framework to look at labor activism and environmental activism, and then see how it doesn't work as well for feminist activism. With feminist activism, there are a variety of different cases, including the Occupy Men's Toilet movement, the Feminist Five, sexual harassment and Me Too campaigns, the hiring discrimination against women, and then the Peng Shuai case, which I'll talk about a little bit. The goal of looking at these different categories is to basically examine over time, so in each of them to look over periods of time across different types of cases to determine what kind of situations can protests be successful and why are they successful. And of course, being able to identify what success actually means. So the picture that you see here is a picture from the China Labor Bulletin. This is actually a screenshot I took yesterday. So in it, this is one great way, if you're interested in labor protests, there's a catalog of labor protests across various locations. There are news articles that link to it, so you can see what type of protests they are, you can see what the issues are, you can follow those cases. But if you're just looking at this map from April to October of 2022, you can see there are quite a number of cases of labor protests. If we were thinking about labor protests 15 years ago, you might not expect to see such large numbers. And so it's another reason why they're interesting is why is it that labor protests are allowed to gain some traction in terms of both gaining attention and then what are the results? And I'm not going to spend much time on labor protests because there are more interesting things to say about the other ones. The environmental protests then, in this case, is in 2012. So if we're looking at, one of the other things to look at is over time, particularly from 2012 to the present and beyond, how we can see the state adapting under what might be seen as stronger, more stricter authoritarian terms. Now, the details of the case, just to briefly give you some information, that this particular case was about the construction of the world's largest copper smelting plant, and the goal of this plant was to help revitalize the local economy. So tying it to economic goals, of course, making it very important to the state. The other part, of course, is to look at the environmental impact. So as you can imagine, the locals were unhappy with the possibility of having this copper plant being put into their community. And the goals were to, of course, halt construction and then to prevent that higher pollution output. Now, there's a lot of other details that I could share about the actual protests, but what's interesting to look at is what makes it a case to examine is look at the timeline. On day one, you had around 200 to 300 protesters. On day two, you had 20,000 protesters, and by day three, you had 30 to 40,000 protesters. Right? This makes it an important case where it quickly could spiral out of control, and you could see why it could garner the attention of the state. The outcome was that the plant construction was halted. So as a result of these protests, and it does take a little bit of negotiation, that the outcome was exactly what the protesters had wanted. So we can see this as an example of a success case. Now, I bring this up in more detail because as we look at how you apply the framework, probably more detail than you want. And again, I'm skipping over the protective regulatory case of the lock factory. If you just look at what happens, what we do is we identify the problem stream, the policy stream, and the politics stream. We categorize it into protective or redistributive. And I want to draw your attention to the analysis, which is where the real findings are. And what we do is we apply this to different cases to see whether or not they're successful. In both the Zhongshan lock case and the Shifang case, these are examples of successful protests, meaning that it fits into one of those categories of accommodation, compromise. And so when we look at the analysis, what we find is that across these two cases and other cases of success, that the problems were intense and salient both nationally and locally. Now, nationally meaning the environmental issues are of national concern, unpaid wages are of national concern, but it wasn't addressing a national entity in the protest itself. The second part, the policy stream, the goals were practical, clearly defined, and local. This is very important. So again, if we want to see what kinds of activism gains the most amount of traction, it is localized protests dealing with a localized condition. The third factor then is to look at the environment. And so the government was receptive to citizen advocacy efforts and had stake in seeing the issues resolved. That goes into more of the details of the case, but the environment was right to address the issues. And again, the timing of it has something to do with it as well, being early on in 2012. So I raise these because when we look at environmental activism and we look at labor activism, we can determine success and we can determine the lack of success in cases. We can also look at the various features that contribute to those things. Now, as we transition to feminist activism, it doesn't fit into that same category very neatly because it's hard to look at some of these cases that I'm going to discuss. It's hard to see how even these smaller scale cases should not necessarily warrant the kind of response that they get. Right, so when we think about these larger cases of environmental activism and labor activism, the fact that the state accommodates some of the requests and compromises is quite surprising. But with even some of these small localized protests when it comes to feminist activism, we don't see the same thing. In fact, what we see is that many of these cases are met with more repressive efforts. So the pictures up here are of three different examples of feminist activism cases. The picture on the left is the Occupy Men's Toilet movement, which was designed where women were occupying men's toilets to raise awareness about the lack of adequate stalls for women. Right, so something very basic, thinking about not having enough bathroom facilities. I actually remember when I was in graduate school at Arizona, we had, our floor was originally designed with 3 men's restrooms and no women's restroom. And so it was, really kind of inconvenient. And then they changed one of them over to women's restroom, but there were never enough stalls. And we did not have an Occupy Men's Toilet movement, but I could see how that could be very successful and very effective. In this particular case, though, something very innocuous like raising awareness about inequity and access to toilet stalls does not seem to make a national challenge. The Occupy Toilets movement was met with resistance and put down relatively quickly. And it's just one example of something very small that's localized that you would not necessarily think would be met with such resistance. The second picture in the middle is the Bloody Brides campaign. And these were 3 women who were walking down just south of Tiananmen Square. There's a road there that has a lot of shops. And so they wore these wedding dresses with ketchup or paint on it to raise awareness about domestic violence against women. Again, not something that you would think would be enough to raise national concern. 3 women trying to raise awareness about domestic violence, but again, put down pretty quickly. The third picture on the right side is a campaign, the Feminist Five. You may be familiar with the Feminist Five, who raised awareness about various women's issues. One of the aspects that got them put in jail was that they had distributed bumper stickers, or were about to distribute bumper stickers to raise awareness about sexual harassment. And so I put on the top, you can see there, the Me Too campaign. So if we think about the Me Too campaign, we think about efforts to raise awareness about sexual harassment towards women. We know that those are not always met with the greatest of ears, even in a Western context. However, doesn't necessarily seem to warrant 5 women wanting to distribute bumper stickers about raising issues about sexual harassment, doesn't seem to warrant the authority of the state coming down on them in such a highly visible campaign. One of the things that I love the most about Chinese is that there are lots of ways that you can play with words in order to bypass the censors. I didn't mention this before, but if you see there hashtag Me Too, one way you can get around the Me Too part is you can say rice bunny, which is Me Too. So you can also see how there are clever ways to try to work around the limits that you have when it comes to things like censorship. So these different demonstrations of feminist activism don't seem like they're enough on such a small scale to warrant such a heavy response. Another case to look at is the Peng Shuai case, and this one is more recent. So if you were paying attention, last year in November, Peng Shuai had posted on her Weibo account that she had been sexually assaulted by a senior party official, and shortly thereafter that post was removed, she disappeared, and there was essentially a search for Peng Shuai. So you can see the where is Peng Shuai. The Women's Tennis Association was greatly concerned because she's a tennis player, and her colleagues, although she had retired, her colleagues were very concerned about her disappearance and what this suggested. And so there was a massive outpour of individuals looking for her and wondering about her well-being. In fact, the Women's Tennis Association actually agreed to no longer have tournaments in China as a result in order to show solidarity because they were concerned about her well-being. So the letter that you see on the right, I should say the picture on the left, this is a shot from the Tennis Channel, and then it says on here, where is Peng Shuai and Serena Williams, who was a tennis player. It posted about that she was devastated to hear about the news, and they were concerned about finding her. If we look at the post on the right, this is the email that was released then, presumably from Peng Shuai, saying that she was fine, and there was a lot of concern that it was fabricated or that it wasn't really from her, that it wasn't authentic, in order to dismiss some of the concerns regarding the claims. If you remember on that second slide, who's in attendance at the 20th Party Congress and who's not, the senior official that she identified is sitting front and center. And so this is another way that this has come up more recently in terms of looking at some of the issues around it. So why is feminist activism different? If we're looking at what makes the feminist activist cases different from the other two and why it doesn't seem to fit, why is it that individual smaller acts of protest warrant such a large response, warrant such a heavy response by the state? There are a few things that we can look at that kind of set the stage. One thing we can see is that the nationalism myth in place is that women were already liberated by the state in 1949. Women hold up half the sky, there's gender equality. So that's already in place. There shouldn't be a need for a feminist movement because women have already achieved liberation. That's sarcasm. The All China Women's Federation is designed to organize women's interests. And so the All China Women's Federation, which is a party organ, is designed to help organize women's interests at the national level and the local level. So there's no need to have more activist interests. Things should funnel through those already established channels. And those are the perspectives, of course, from the state. Feminist activism is also linked to foreign enemies. And so when we think about feminist movements, these are not seen as being generated from within China, but are instigated from Western and foreign forces. And so as a result, it ties in perfectly with the rhetoric of being concerned about being concerned about foreign enemies infiltrating Chinese society in order to make changes. So feminist activism is also linked to foreign enemies. And again, these are the perspectives of the state. Now, if we think of some of the challenges that women are facing have also come as a result of the one-child policy. And if we look at the changes to sex ratios, this has led to concerns about discrimination against women in the labor force, discrimination in education, and a variety of other challenges specifically to women. And so as a result, we can see that this directly reflects back on the state and is more than just a localized problem. Another reason why there is concern over women and feminist activism is that there is a lot of research on women's movements and democracy. And with that, we've seen that there, in a number of different country cases, that democracy activism is most successful when women are engaged in it. And so it is important for women to be involved in it, and that has the best chances of success. And oftentimes that's through women's issues that women get actively engaged in political protest. And so if you're looking at that from the perspective of the Chinese state, that does pose an interesting and unique challenge that is beyond just looking at toilets or beyond looking at the possibilities of dealing with issues of discrimination or sexual harassment. So feminist activism is different. If we look at civil society then under Xi, this is my last slide, I promise. There are a number of issues that I think are important to understand what kinds of movements have traction now and have the potential to be dangerous in the future. There are some things we can see in terms of what Xi has done that address aspects of the authoritarian state and how it tries to crack down on, how it tries to allow certain elements of civil society to thrive but preserve itself. One of the things we can, of course, see is that Xi Jinping's campaign against corruption can be seen in a positive light in terms of cracking down on corruption can help quell unrest and build trust in the state. But when it comes to feminist issues, there are certain factors that we have to look at. One is that they challenge masculine state authority, and this is why it becomes important, more than just a localized interest. The issues that are addressed are a private and national threat, meaning if we're looking at what public means, it means out in the public sphere. When you start dealing with the private realm inside of the home or family dynamics outside of that public realm, that creates a different kind of challenge. It's not public and localized, it's private and represents a national threat. In addition, then, we do see that the Chinese state has had increased responsiveness on localized issues. So one of the ways that it has adapted is it has allowed protests to occur, and it has been responsive on certain localized issues. So when we put all of these things together, it is important to see that some elements of protest are allowed to exist in certain categories. So we have to figure out what those categories are, and again, why they're allowed to exist. One of the reasons you can argue is that the safety valve allowing protests to occur, allowing dissent to occur, helps release citizen tension, and that avoids it from becoming a pressure cooker situation. Right? If you don't let any information out, that has the potential to be catastrophic. It builds tension, and then that release is going to be much more dangerous. So these safety valves then help release a little bit of that tension to give the state the ability to respond in certain areas, look like it's responsive, and then also keep some of the major issues under its wraps. The authoritarian state, China's authoritarian state, will remain resilient and adaptive. Right? One of the things that we've seen is it has adjusted in many ways. It's not just a strict use of repression, although with certain groups under certain issues we do see that, but it is adapting in ways that allow for certain elements of civil society to exist. We'll just have to stay tuned to see what authoritarianism 3.0 looks like since we're still in 2.0. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Currier. Fascinating talk. Our next presentation is by Brandon Zhang. Brandon, by way of background, Brandon was a student here at Rice about a decade ago, I think he started. He actually has admitted to me that he came to Rice specifically to be a religious studies major. to be a religious major. And that will become increasingly clear, and the relevance of that as we go throughout the presentation. I hired Brandon after he graduated and he went off to China and began to teach English. I hired him to help us do some of our studies of outdoor political propaganda in Chinese cities. I'd started in 1998, over 20 years ago, walking through 5 different districts in Beijing, 5 different districts in Shanghai, multiple streets within each one, just walking down the street and capturing a photo of every piece of political propaganda that you would see outdoors, that people would be encountering every day when they walk outside the doors. And I did that every 5 years. Then Brandon comes along and said, Brandon, I would like you to go to Beijing, I'd like you to go to Shanghai and do all of these. He also greatly helped out in going around to other cities in China and also in other places, taking photos of commercial and public service advertisements in subway systems, which is another one of our projects. After he did the Beijing and Shanghai subway or Shanghai outdoor surveys in 2019, we asked him to return, and he joined us as a research associate, putting together our archive. We have an online digital archive with almost 3,000 images in which Brandon has translated, transcribed, coded, and basically become an expert on urban outdoor propaganda. And so I've asked him to share some of his insights from these propaganda studies. You can also find online a policy brief he did last summer looking at nationalism and how nationalism has changed under Xi Jinping. And you can find that online on our website. So please join me in welcoming Brandon Zhang.
All right, here goes nothing. Okay. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Dr. Lewis. So, I like to describe what I'm doing here as a combination of both a political scientist and symbologist. In other words, a little bit of Tom Hanks's character from the Da Vinci Code. But instead of trying to figure out what's lying underneath the Mona Lisa's right eye, we're trying to figure out, well, what's underneath Mao Zedong's right eye. But the history of Chinese propaganda is rife with symbolism that's not necessarily immediately apparent to outside observers. However, as we go a little bit further in, I hope that we'll be able to take a look at the way that these symbols are used, the way that historical associations with these visual motifs are remixed into a new context, and the way that they continue to gain relevance and accrue new meanings under Xi Jinping. So, as we start, of course, there's no way you can really look at Communist Party propaganda without addressing the archetype himself, Mao Zedong. This is very much a typical poster of the time. More specifically, this is actually from the zenith of Mao Zedong's power in terms of ideologically over the nation, the Cultural Revolution. So we see that Mao is actually quite large. He's very much front and center, but more than that, in the background, there's sort of a mix between naturalistic and idealized sort of background. We see that there are, winds that, let's imply to be winds of change. We can see a little bit of the blue sky in the background, blue sky that invokes, of course, the blue sky and white sun of the Republic of China and its flag. You might recognize it today as the flag of Taiwan. But we see the winds of change essentially blowing away the blue, and we see a field of red, a red that might either be fields or flags or maybe a little bit of both. Perhaps the artist has left it a little bit ambiguous. So we actually see this in other countries as well. So for example, John Stuart Curry in his painting in the Kansas State Capitol, The Tragic Prelude, this is perhaps one of the most famous examples of this sort of device being used in American art. So for here, we see that John Brown is very much larger than life, roughly twice as tall as anybody else in the picture, we see that essentially all around him are natural phenomena that are happening. Well, the causality between John Brown and the natural phenomena is a bit ambiguous, and that's kind of the point. The idea simply is to say that this person represents something far more than just a person. And as we see here, he's representing the entirety of the Civil War. So, as well as the traditional tropes that we associate with the Communist Party during this time, there is some of the nationalism that we'll see more of as we enter later decades. So here is a typical poster from a National Day celebration in the mid-1970s towards the end of the Cultural Revolution. So one of the first things that we see in the front are well, for lack of a better word, dancing minorities in colorful outfits. This is one of the motifs that appears quite a bit in the propaganda of the Communist Party. You see, China, while over 90% of its population is, in fact, ethnically Han Chinese, the other remaining roughly 10% belong to 55 different minority groups. And under the Communist Party's official ideology, all 56 groups together form the Chinese nation. Now, the fact that the Han form over 90% of the nation does sort of skew the actual representativeness of the nation, but it's the thought that counts. Furthermore, they are in front of perhaps what some of you might recognize as the Gate of Heavenly Peace, or Tiananmen. This used to be the entrance to the Qing Emperor's palace, and it in fact was the building on which Mao stood on October the 1st, 1949, when he officially proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. This building not only has national significance because of its history as, well, a representative of the emperor, but also because of its significance ideologically as the place where the PRC specifically was founded. After Mao's death, we see a continuation of many of the themes of nationalism, but we see them diffused away from the idea of a cult of personality. In this particular mural, which was created for the Tianjin City Hall in the 1980s, the emphasis on party leadership is still there, but it's much more subtle. So Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, is very much less of a central figure, and in fact, he was known more for being a power behind the throne than for claiming attention in the way that Mao himself did. So Deng would be the man in the blue suit in the middle of the sofa over there. Now, to the left, we actually see Hu Yaobang, who was the party secretary, which is nominally the #1 position in China. But of course, again, Deng was the power behind the throne. To the right, in the glasses and the gray suit, we see Zhao Ziyang, the premier of China, who is in theory the head of state of China, but because the party ranks above the state, he is in fact the #2 man. These two happen to be Deng's proteges, and one thing you might notice is that they're both in Western suits. This would never have been allowed while Mao was alive. Furthermore, the nationalism that's being expressed is, again, much more subtle. We see a few minorities in colorful traditional outfits towards the left over there. In the background, we see another mural, a mural within a mural, this one of the Great Wall of China, which, when used in official party propaganda, always represents the nation, just like Tiananmen. However, beyond just that, we see many figures, some of whom are in fact well known to Chinese people. So the members of the Chinese National Ballet over there in the front. We have certain members of the Chinese Olympic gymnastics team. So in 1984, the Los Angeles Olympics were in fact the first Olympics in which the People's Republic of China participated. So this was a fairly big deal. We also see a few other luminaries, which unfortunately I don't quite have time to go over, but the idea is that, well, the Chinese nation is still great. The party wants to make sure that nobody doubts that, but the greatness is now shared amongst multiple people, not just government officials, but also ordinary people who happen to have achieved great feats. However, the most important single figure here is still Mao Zedong himself. As we see over there in front of the Great Wall mural, the man in white, the white bust, he is still the largest person in the room, and we can see everybody around the bust laying flowers. So He still has a prominent place, but the message of this mural is that while he's still respected, he's no longer the guy. As we can see, nationalism does have a very long history in the symbology of the Communist Party's propaganda. So it's not just ideology. And the reason for this, to understand this, we need to go over some historical context, which is that when the CCP took over in 1949, it essentially ended a long period of national disunity. This national disunity was seen as the cause of what most Chinese people would call the century of humiliation. Now, some of you might have heard of this phrase, and it roughly, give or take a decade or so, it spanned from around 1840 or so until, well, 1949 with the foundation of the People's Republic. It is associated very much with foreign invasion and foreign exploitation of China. And just to show you some of the most well-known examples, in 1842, we have the First Opium War. This was the war in which the United Kingdom took over Hong Kong. In 1858, Russia signed one of its many unequal treaties with China, and this is in fact why Russia owns Vladivostok now. It used to be part of Qing territory until this time. In 1860, this was the Second Opium War, and the United Kingdom and France made it all the way into Beijing. This was the first time that foreigners burnt down the Summer Palace. In 1895, the First Sino-Japanese War. This was the war that resulted in the Treaty of Shimonoseki, in other words, the treaty that gave Taiwan to Japan. 1900, Russia decided to invade Manchuria again because it felt that past commitments for establishing an economic sphere of influence in the region were not being honored. 1900 again, the eight-nation alliance, one of these nations being the United States, marched into Beijing, and this was the second time that foreigners burnt down the Summer Palace. 1905, if you'll take a look just before Russia and Japan had just fought wars in China, and part of the casus belli was for influence over the northeastern part of China. The Russians and then the Japanese then got in disagreement over this and decided to fight a war with each other over control of northeastern China. In 1915, after the foundation of the Republic of China, Yuan Shikai went to the Japanese and asked for a financial loan, and the Japanese agreed on 21 conditions. These 21 conditions, had they been agreed to, would have made China into essentially a Japanese puppet state. The only reason that these demands were not, in fact, ratified is that the details got leaked and, well, there was a revolt. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles. Now, Germany, of course, after its loss in World War I, had to cede pretty much all of its overseas colonies. And in the case of its Asian colonies, specifically all of its ports and concessions on the Chinese seaboard, there was a question of what to do with them. And the Allies, during the Treaty of Versailles, decided to give them to Japan in order to reward Japan for its help for its helping the Allies in the war. This was, in fact, this caused the May 4th protests, which were one of the precursors to the foundation of the Communist Party of China just 2 years later. Okay, that was the wrong button. 1931, so Japan, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, a false flag incident that gave them the excuse to invade Manchuria again, and this time not just establish a sphere of influence, but create an actual puppet state, Manchukuo. 1934, funny enough, the Soviet Union, one might not know this, but the Soviet Union encouraged quite a bit of business going on in the northwest in Xinjiang province, the Second Turkestan Republic. And finally, of course, perhaps most infamously, in 1937, Japan decided it wasn't satisfied with the northeastern part of China. It decided to invade the rest of it too. This culminated in the winter with the rape of Nanking after the capture of the Republic of China's capital. Now, the United States didn't engage as much in direct military warfare, but there was definitely, we had our moments. In this case, extraterritoriality. So, to summarize it up simply, extraterritoriality is basically what we do for diplomats. In other words, when a diplomat is in another country, they can't get arrested for the crimes they do. It's only the country that sent them that can handle it. This was actually quite common for foreigners in China, not just diplomats, but any foreign citizen who was in China. And in particular, in those dates, those were the years that the UK and the US set up separate courts specifically for those concessions. In the case of the American courts, If one wanted to appeal a decision made there, you had to go to the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. Cases in that court never touched Chinese magistrates' hands. Now, after the Communist Party unified China politically in 1949, that was seen as the end of the century of national humiliation, but in reality, there was still quite a bit going on to keep the nation fragmented. And we can see this in some of the propaganda, especially that relating to language. So in this case, the linguistic diversity of China is a huge factor. Depending on who you might ask, what many people consider the Chinese language can be anywhere from 7 to 10 to perhaps even more languages. At the very least, 7 is the minimum number for the mutually intelligible ones. So, excuse me. One of the things that is perhaps a little less publicized about Chinese leaders during the Republican and Communist eras is that from the foundation of the Republic of China in 1912, it is not until almost a century later, in 2002, that we actually have a Chinese leader who can speak standard Chinese, what most of you think of when you think of Chinese. Sun Yat-sen, the first leader, is in fact a native Cantonese speaker, so that, according to linguists, is yue, so this bright purple bit towards the bottom. In fact, there is a famous story about him giving a speech in Shanghai, an impromptu speech in Shanghai after the revolution that overthrew the emperor. After the guards present who listened to the speech were asked by a journalist what they thought about the speech, the policeman essentially responded with, "Yeah, we have no idea. He's speaking in Cantonese. We only know Shanghainese. Yeah, we have no idea." There was something quite similar going on with Chiang Kai-shek. In fact, of course, we see Shanghai there is in that bright blue area. Chiang Kai-shek is also in that bright blue area, just a little bit to the south, and is in fact a dialect of Wu that is not entirely intelligible with Shanghainese. So even in these colors, we have a bit of diversity here. After the foundation of the People's Republic, we have Mao Zedong, of course. Mao came from the dark green area, the one labeled Xiang, so in Hunan. In fact, his Xiang was so incomprehensible to other Chinese people that within China, he had a translator who translated everything he said from Xiang to Mandarin for Chinese people. After Mao's death, power behind the throne again, so the man who led China either directly or behind the scenes throughout most of the 80s, Deng Xiaoping, came from Sichuan. So that is the larger, sort of more lavender area towards the southwest. He was the first leader to actually talk live on TV, televised, and they had to put subtitles for him. In fact, to this day, it's considered standard practice on Chinese TV to just always put subtitles when people talk, no matter what their dialect or language is. Jiang Zemin did a little bit better. What he spoke was technically a type of Mandarin, so this blood red area a bit to the north of Shanghai. He was from Yangzhou, so actually very close to that borderline between the maroon and blue. But again, it is not until Hu Jintao, who took power in 2002, that we have, again, a paramount leader who can speak standard Chinese based off Beijing Mandarin. So moving beyond some of this historical context, let's take a look at some of the textual language of Chinese propaganda. So since Mao, there have been 4 generations of Chinese leaders. So Mao was part of the first generation. The current leader, Xi, is in the 5th generation. So after Mao, the first duo that we have, the first power duo, is Hu Yaobang, the general secretary. So this person is nominally the most powerful person in the country. And then Zhao Ziyang, the number 2 guy. Their main slogan was socialism with Chinese characteristics. This might be familiar to many of you. In the 1990s, the leadership duo was largely made up of Jiang Zemin, the secretary, and Zhu Rongji, the premier. And the main slogan, the official slogan that was used during this time was the 3 represents. Okay, so I'd like to take a moment to pause for a bit. I'd like to ask anyone in the audience, but especially those of you who are from China, if you know what the 3 represents are, feel free to raise your hand. Okay, well, we actually had no idea what would happen, but it seems like the predicted result happened. The phrase, the 3 represents, is quite well known in China, but not very many people in China actually know what the 3 represents are. We actually had to look it up and double check too. Essentially, there are the three things that the Communist Party is supposed to represent. It represents economic growth in China, it represents cultural development, and it represents the only thing that's protecting the ordinary person from the harmful effects of economic liberalization. So essentially, they're saying we're the only ones who can guide the country through this transition without everything falling apart. In the 2000s, in the aughts, we have Hu Jintao, the general secretary, so again, the number one boss, and then his deputy, Wen Jiabao. So the official slogan during this time was the scientific outlook on development. And you might be noticing a trend here, which is that it's mentioning a lot less socialism. The most current, the fifth and current generation of leadership, Xi Jinping as paramount leader and Li Keqiang as premier. So from the 18th to so far the 20th, and maybe beyond, the Chinese dream. One thing that we start noticing immediately as this gets less and less ideological and gets more and more vague and, well, for lack of a better word, generic. Now, in the actual posters from each of these generations, we can see these slogans being put into action. So in the case of Marxist socialism under the leaders of the 80s, so Hu and Zhao, there are the usual ideological symbols. So naturally, the whole poster is red, so that's perhaps the most obvious part. We see a lot of doves. There's a lot of doves in communist propaganda. There's also the hammer and sickle, so that one probably needs a little explanation. In the bottom left there, we see a huabiao, so the stone column. The huabiao was a symbol of imperial authority, and going up the top, going up the middle, we can see the imperial dragon. On the top, there's the imperial lion. But also in the middle there, the wing-looking thingies, those are auspicious clouds, and they're always drawn that specific way, that specific art style. They're not just any clouds, those are auspicious clouds. But more subtly in the background, we can see skyscrapers, of course, and that rocket ship taking off right there. Yeah, that's not really supposed to happen in such a crowded area, but, well, it's more meant to spread a message, which is that nationalism, ideology, and economic development all go hand in hand, or at least they do on this poster. Under Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, we have the three represents, and here we can see the visual motifs that they're using are a little bit more approachable. We see lots of tall buildings. We see, well, in the middle there, that's clearly meant to be some sort of mall. That's actually a cinema of some sort. So there's clearly some message of consumption, the idea that building a place where people can shop and play and work is part of the goal of the Communist Party. Over here, we can see that the propaganda is definitely getting a lot less ideological. It's definitely looking a lot more like something you might actually see in a real-life photo. And once we reach the generation right before the current one, Hu and Wen, who ruled during most of the aughts, the scientific outlook on development is, like its predecessors, an official slogan. So there is, in fact, official status given to this phrase. But just because it does spread to the party cadres, just because the party members have to learn about it, doesn't mean they really care whether it spreads to the ordinary people. So it didn't really show up in propaganda very much. And in fact, Hu Jintao is the only one of the five paramount leaders that whose name just doesn't show up in the propaganda in our archives. The trend we're seeing here essentially is performance legitimacy. They're turning away from the ideological aspects, and they're trying to focus simply on the practical parts. Simply put, what they're trying to express is, we're going to put ideology to the side right now, and we're going to let the results of the economic reforms speak for themselves. And your average Chinese person, the average citizen in China would probably agree with the party in that sense of those results. Now, this mindset is perhaps expressed most succinctly by the famous Deng Xiaoping quote, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." And so we see this performance legitimacy being expressed in a few other ways. We're going to go ahead and take a look at slightly more specific examples, and one of these is urbanization. As China's demographics change, as China urbanizes and goes from a majority rural country to a majority urban country, we see the corresponding changes in the propaganda. So here we see the background here, the urbanization. We see the economic changes in the country being directly associated with following traffic laws. The idea being that in an economically developed country, you have to follow traffic laws, which, to be fair, is most true. It can get a little less subtle, though. This is perhaps this is a rather special case. These types of flashy posters tend to be made specifically to be given to peasants who, generally speaking, have less access to very colorful posters than urban residents do. But we see here the juxtaposition of all the symbols is done a little bit more blatantly. For one, we actually see not one but two Chinese flags, so the one over there on the top left and the one down there towards the bottom left, and that one is not, in fact, a flag being held aloft by a military parade. Throughout the bottom of the screen, we see peonies, which are the national flower of China. There's Tiananmen again over there to the left. We see, well, Xi Jinping basically dividing the whole screen, so between the abstract, ideological parts and the supposedly practical parts. So that is the skyline of Pudong, so the new economically advanced part of Shanghai. For some reason, there is a rocket ship taking off from there again. In the middle of the Yangtze River, near the mouth of the river, several thousand miles, well, about 1,000 miles or so to the east of where it actually is the Three Gorges Dam, which they managed to transport here not through engineering but Photoshop. And finally, we have a high-speed rail train coming out of the peonies. So either the peonies are large or the train is small. These are slightly more subtle ones, posters that are used for less ideological purposes. Over here on the left, we see, so these are actually posters for Beijing and Shanghai, respectively. And we see another trend here, which is the use of local landmarks to symbolize, use of local symbols. So on the left is the Pavilion of Heaven, also known as the Tiantan. This is essentially the only building in Beijing that can be used in government propaganda to represent Beijing. The reason being that pretty much every other building in Beijing has been co-opted by the national government to represent China. See, for example, Tiananmen. To the right, we see the Bund, which, in fact, if you, in the previous one, Shanghai, this is the new side, so this is the east side of the river. This would be the west side, and in fact, the Bund was the main symbol of Shanghai before Pudong became as recognizable as it is today, and it represented openness and opening up to the world. Furthermore, we see other more generic symbols of economic development, so skyscrapers and highway overpasses. During a time when most people got around on bikes instead of cars, that was probably seen as progress. Given the traffic jams in Beijing now, it might be more doubtful. Perhaps the zenith of this emphasis on performance legitimacy, on results speaking for themselves, came in the two events at the end of the decade where China, to put it lightly, had its coming out party. The 2008 Olympics in Beijing and the 2010 World Expo in Shanghai. This is the scaffolding on a kiosk, essentially reminding those who are volunteering for the Olympics to be friendly to all the tourists. And on the side of this kiosk, they make it pretty clear who the tourists are supposed to be. The first thing we notice, of course, is the Tiantan again. So we all know this is in Beijing. The second thing, this is not a motif commonly used in government propaganda, but it is actually quite common in Chinese commercial ads. That is photoshopped white people. While I was living in China, my roommates, my friends, specifically my white friends, they never hired my black or Asian friends, but my white friends would often talk about what they called white monkey work, which was essentially they would go to the studio, they would have, they would pose for some shots, and then their likeness would just be photoshopped onto something. They had no idea what, but they got a paycheck out of it, and so it was a decent gig. That was probably what happened to these two. Of course, the presence of this symbolizes international presence, international prestige. For the Shanghai World Expo, there's another symbol of Shanghai. This is the China Pavilion. That was the only building in the expo that was meant to be permanent. It's still there today, and it's an art museum. Over there on the bottom, of course, we see the entire globe. It's meant to symbolize the fact that the World Expo is China opening up to the world. Although the characters towards the left happen to be covering most of the NATO countries, and the Gumby-looking guy over there is covering most of the inhabited parts of Australia. And it's a little bit unclear as to whether this is intentional or not, and that is also fairly common. Now, all of these previous trends that we've been looking at so far, they all really culminate in the propaganda released under current leader Xi Jinping. Many commentators have suggested that Xi is trying to bring back the era of Mao, but in reality, what's really going on is it's more like he's creating a synthesis of previous ideas. Here, we can actually see this synthesis literally in all of the symbols being juxtaposed. So we see the national symbols, the Hua Biao again, over in the bottom left. We see Tiananmen once more. There's a Great Wall, actually, slightly there in the background. And we can even see some auspicious clouds a little bit to the right of the text over there. But we also see some symbols of economic progress. So in the background, we see skyscrapers. And in fact, some of those skyscrapers aren't just generic skyscrapers. There's the CCTV tower towards the left. You can actually see the Jianmao Tower near the right. And once again, there is another rocket ship taking off. This is where we see these ads perhaps like on. Well, this is supposed to be an environmental ad, energy saving and emission reduction of the Green Line. It's encouraging citizens to adopt a more low carbon lifestyle. And yet it really does look like an environmental ad on steroids, doesn't it? There really isn't much green, but there is a lot of red. There is the Chinese flag again in the top left. There are the revolutionary martyrs in the bottom left. There's the imperial lion, and there are more auspicious clouds. It's at this time that I should note that actually use of the Chinese flag in propaganda like this is actually relatively rare. Usually it's a generic red background or it has the hammer and sickle. For it to include the actual 5 stars of the Chinese flag, that's relatively rare historically, but has happened more and more under Xi. It should be noted that China Dream is very ambiguous. It's not really clear what it's supposed to mean, and we sort of see that they were doing this intentionally. Now these were posters that were hung up, these were banners that were hung up on traffic barriers around 10 years ago in 2012 in order to announce the 18th Party Congress. So we see the Chinese text front and center, but just above it, much smaller, we see the Tibetan text. These banners were meant to be hung up in Tibet. We see much of this symbolism is laid on quite a bit thicker. Here we see, again, the stars and the red background, so not just ideological, but also nationalistic. The hammer sickle again, Tiananmen there over on the bottom left of the bottom banner. Dancing minorities again, the Hua Biao there. Also doves. They always include doves. And, oh yes, Hua Biao. So Hua Biao for both of these, so the symbol of imperial and now simply national authority. And finally, over there on the bottom, that is in fact a skyline of a panoramic shot of Lhasa. In fact, in the middle over there with the little red dot, that is Potala Palace, the historical home of the Dalai Lama before he had to flee the country in the 1950s. There is a clear message being sent here as well, and it's a lot less subtle. In this one, the nation is emphasized above the local, and in the case of Tibetans, this is very much relevant. Finally, we see that Xi Jinping is adding his name to the core party ideology. By tradition, every time the leaders change, they add part of their governing philosophy to the constitution. Xi is the first one since Deng Xiaoping to actually include his name on the party ideology. And for a little bit of context, again, this is Marx, this is Lenin, this is Mao Zedong, this is Deng Xiaoping. So these are all revolutionary leaders who radically changed the course of the country during their time in office. Xi is very clearly trying to portray himself as a revolutionary who's going to change things rather than like his 2 immediate predecessors who simply kept things going. As an added element of this, of course, Xi Jinping has used the title core leader for the first time since Mao. It really fell into abeyance after his death. It really was quietly de-emphasized and then dropped, but Xi really brought it back in a big way. Once again, this is not just a red background, but actually the stars over there, that's the Chinese flag. So again, historically not that common, a lot more common as we go on in Xi's time in office. Tiananmen, once again, these sorts of posters actually are quite common around this time of year, around the time of the Party Congress annually. However, mentioning Xi's name this much and using so many of these symbols, that is unusual even by the standards of the Communist Party's propaganda. There is a very clear message that things are changing that's being sent with this. And perhaps there's no better way to show the shift in this message than from this picture, which was in fact taken only a few weeks ago. So this banner has been hanging up on this overpass ever since the Congress started in Beijing. So it is, excuse me, not since it started Beijing, but essentially in anticipation of the start of Congress. Roughly translated, it means, so if anybody can call me out, please be gentle. I'm trying to paraphrase here, but write the Beijing chapter of the story of Chinese socialist modernization, of Chinese comprehensive socialist modernization under the principles of Xi Jinping thought on Chinese socialism for the new era. And yeah, the phrase socialism does appear twice. You're not necessarily even meant to read the whole thing unless you're stuck in a traffic jam. However, as my uncle once put it when I mentioned this to him, you're not really supposed to read these. You're just supposed to know that they're there. So what do we really make of all this? Well, Simon Leys, one of the most famous Western scholars of China, in fact, the first Westerner to tell the rest of the world about the Cultural Revolution, had his thoughts on the matter. The analyst must absorb industrial quantities of the most indigestible stuff. Reading communist literature is akin to munching rhinoceros sausage or to swallowing sawdust. In that sense, we can consider this presentation to be, well, an intellectual form of Pepto-Bismol, and hopefully I've helped the sausage go down just a little bit easier. And of course, I would like to thank these sponsors for their help. Thanks.
Congratulations. Good job. Good job. Thank you. Please have a seat. So thank you very much for that very engaging presentation, Brandon. I love the phrase white monkey. I've heard this also. And it made me think, actually, in the mid-'80s, when I was teaching at Beijing Normal University, they came up to the foreign teachers one day and they said, hey, would you like to see the Great Hall of the People? And we said, sure, we'd love to go see the Great Hall of the People. And they go, yeah, you're going to find out a little bit about China and education. So they packed us all up on a bus. We went down there. We went into one of the rooms of the Great Hall of the People. We sat down on the front, and finally a bunch of other people from all foreigners came in from other places, and they all sat us down. And then, literally, I'm about 30 feet away, Zhao Ziyang, then premier, walks in, sits down, and he's surrounded by a bunch of other people, and he starts reading, an address talking about Chinese education policy, how much we're opening up, we're viewing the world. Then they finish. They stand up and start applauding. We stand up, start applauding. They march out of the room, and we turn around to our people from our university. What just happened? And they explained, oh, he was talking about our policy of opening up to the outside world. And we said, okay, cool. Can we see the rest of the Great Hall? Oh no, there's no time to see that. So they could tell we were upset. So they took us for Hangzhou-style baozi, which is like Xiaolong Bao on the way home. So we were, well fed. They brought us back home. All in all, we considered a good day at the circus. So that's kind of how propaganda also works. And I would say, since this was in the 80s, I guess that would make me OG white monkey. Just guessing, okay? So I would like to talk step back a little bit and talk about the man. Since it's clear that this party Congress, Xi Jinping, will be continuing forward, they changed the party constitution last time to allow him to serve more than 2 terms. This would be the beginning of his 3rd term. Well, we'll be watching, as Carrie mentioned, we'll be watching to see who are the leaders going forward, and is there anybody who looks like an anointed successor? All of his predecessors created successors. By the assignment of roles and titles, you could kind of guess who would be the next person, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But I thought it would be also just to talk a little bit, why is this man so exceptional? Why has he managed to pull off what none of his predecessors, except for maybe Deng Xiaoping, have done since Chairman Mao? And so I thought, well, let me talk a little bit about Xi Jinping, the man, kind of where he came from and what we know about him and why he is where he is today. I liked this image. These are all posters in Shanghai in 2016 showing Xi Jinping. What I especially love about it is the passerby. stopping to look at these posters, which are all the same, but they're looking at them and perhaps even discussing them. So it's possible there's some type of graffiti, something obscene, for example, they've stopped to look at. But I think what it's actually is a really nice metaphor for my role, but also our role here too, is that we're trying to describe something which is basically two-dimensional. It's very unlikely that anything I will talk about today will give us any really insight into Xi Jinping to make him into a truly three-dimensional person, because there's almost no information available about him as a person. And so it's very hard for us to understand how you can go from this is him, he's on the left with his father and his younger brother in 1958, he's 5 years old, to this last year, okay? And yes, that is an indoor space, to an enormous jumbo screen. This is during the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. There he is giving a speech on top of Tiananmen. And those are like tiny little people, including what Brandon mentioned, the shiny, happy, colorful minority people down in front, but also undoubtedly thousands of soldiers and student volunteers and all kinds of people. This is kind of worthy of the Olympics, all of these and the great show. But even though he's jumbo sized, it makes us wonder, who actually is this man? Well, we can actually look at some evidence of his mindset, even though he's had very few chances of I think opportunities where he's presented himself through interviews. This one was in 2000, where he was actually an alternate to one of the earlier party congresses. He was not a very high-ranking leader at this time, but somebody interviewed him and he said, people who have little contact with power, who are far from it, always see these things as mysterious and novel. But what I see is not just the superficial things, the power, the flowers, the glory, the applause. I see the bullpens and how people can blow hot and cold. I understand politics on a deeper level. By bullpens, he was actually referring to detention centers, where people were being held before they were struggled against during the Cultural Revolution. They were being exposed as class enemies and struggled against publicly, as happened to his father, for example, and people in his family. And so I think this provides us a little bit of insight into how this is a man who views politics differently. Let me see if I can kind of explain why this makes sense and why somebody like Xi Jinping would say something like this. So again, going back to his childhood, so he was born in 1953. Here he is, 1950, with his father and younger brother. The important person in this is actually the man on the right. That is Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping was not born into an average family. He is what we call a princeling. Okay, he may not be dressed like a prince, but he is actually a princeling. His father was one of the most highest ranked party leaders when the concept, what did he do very specifically? And so what might Xi Jinping have inherited? His father on the right he was in his 40s. He was born in 1913, 2 years after the fall of the empire, and a year after Sun Yat-sen had declared himself the head of the new republic and then had promptly resigned because of Yuan Shikai and other warlords. And so throughout the teens and even in the 20s, China, as Brandon had mentioned, was riven by warlords, factionalism, fighting and striving, all kinds of chaos. During this period, actually, many people proposed a federal type system for China. So this is why when you talk to Chinese political scientists or Chinese leaders and you talk about federalism, they almost like spit on the ground because they associate federalism with an absolute failure. It didn't keep out the foreigners, and in particular, it just precipitated us being abused further and invaded by Japan. So this is like the worst possible situation. So this is what Xi Jinping's father grows up in. He grows up in a very poor area, Shanxi in western China, which is also the cradle, you could say, of Han civilization, just north of Xi'an, the ancient capital. But by this period, after several thousand years, it looks more like Greece or Italy or Lebanon, thousands of years of civilization. And what do you have? You have lots of hills, very scenic things, but you have very little vegetation. You have no trees and very little water. So think of West Virginia with no water and no trees. that's basically Shanxi and just how poor it is. That's where Xi Jinping's father, Xi Jinping, grew up. In his teens, he had to witness all of the chaos and the Civil War. He actually joined the Communist Youth League in the early 1920s, just after the Communist Party was formed. He participated in some strikes and some attacks, and he was jailed by the nationalist regime. Before he was even 15, he joined the Communist Party while he was in jail. He was eventually released, and he became very quickly one of these kind of local leaders working with the Communist Party and the military to set up what was called the Gansu Ningxia Soviet. So these were all the little pockets of government that the communists had formed mainly in very remote areas, because every time throughout the 1920s they tried to institute a good Soviet-style revolution in the treaty ports or in the major cities, they were beaten like a gong. So even in 1927, August 1st, the famous time in Chinese history, the People's Liberation Army announced, we're going to take over Nanchang and Jiangxi on the Yangtze River, and they were beaten brutally. So that's the anniversary of the founding of the People's Liberation Army, August 1st, 1927, but it actually represents, a big failure. Although what it meant was that slowly Mao and the other communist leaders from China began to kick out the Soviet advisors, the Communist International people, and they retreated to these rural bases in East China and in South China. And then the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, working with their German advisors, Nazi Germany was a close ally, actually, of nationalist China, worked to encircle these with troops and bunkers and all these strategies. And finally, this led to the very famous breakout movement called the Long March, where the communists of the East China and South China basically broke out, thousands of them, marched west and then far north and then back east again, and they ended up in the Gansu Ningxia area at a place called Yan'an, which is exactly the area that Xi Jinping's father was one of the leaders. He was what we call a political commissar. So he's a lot like Deng Xiaoping. He was the political member attached to the army units. And so for this, he got to know many, many generals. He also understood logistics, mobilization, even public education work to get people to work with the military. And throughout the 1930s and 1940s, during the war against Japan, he actually is working with some very famous generals, including Peng Dehuai, who would later be the leader of Chinese forces during the Korean War, and then other leaders as well. He, because of Gansu and Ningxia is an area that's bordering Xinjiang and also Tibet, he also becomes quite familiar with all of the interplay of local people rebelling against, first the nationalists, then the communists, and also fighting the Japanese. So anyway, so this is the environment that Xi Jinping's father is playing a very successful role as a mobilizer. In the early 1930s, he falls afoul of kind of a leftist and anti-leftist movement within the Chinese Communist Party, and he's imprisoned, and he's actually scheduled to be executed. And when Mao and the other communists arrive in Yan'an, and reportedly Mao said, okay, let these people go. They're going to work for me going forward. And so from that point on, supposedly, he was working for Mao. In the 1940s, he continues this type of work, working with minority people, working with the military. And this is why in 1951, we have this photo, which shows Xi Jinping on the left and the Panchen Lama, which is the number 2 Lama within the system. The Panchen Lama is known as the great scholar. The Dalai Lama, whom you may know, more famous, is known as the great teacher. They're supposed to educate each other, okay, and kind of lead the Tibetan religion, the Tibetan government. And he is there to try to persuade the Panchen Lama to help persuade ethnic Tibetans to kind of get on board with the new national government. And just kind of as a sign, by the way, whenever you see a senior Chinese communist leader with that little silver object on his left, that's a fountain pen, okay? You think, why is a fountain pen important? What it says is, I'm here to listen and take notes. So I'm the senior person, but I'm here to take notes. What that means is I'm here to talk. I'm here to negotiate. You can see him here, same thing with the fountain pen, but he's with a man called in Chinese Bao'erhan, Bao'erhan Shahidi, who is actually one of the longest running leaders of Uyghurs and Tatar people in Western China on the right. So this is the year later, and he's out in Xinjiang in Western China also playing this type of role. Later on, the Dalai Lama and other people who met him, Dalai Lama met him in 1954 and said, Xi Jinping was somebody basically you could work with. This is very nice. He was more comparatively open-minded compared to other people. So in 2012, when Xi Jinping, his son, comes into power, there's like a brief moment where Tibetans in exile are like, who knows? Maybe the son is like the father, and this is somebody we can work with. I think we all know how this ended up. It did not end up as people had expected. So by the end of the 1950s, here he is in Beijing with the whole family. These also includes children from a previous marriage. There were many senior leaders who had multiple wives. Either people died during the revolution, or some of them actually gave up earlier wives for later wives, gave up peasant wives for more urbane lives, like Chairman Mao, who ended up with Madame Mao. I think she was an actress, singer, film star. Here they are in the end of the 1950s. Xi Jinping, the father, is already in his late 40s. He looks a little bit older than that. He should, because by the end of the 1950s, they've gone through land reform that killed millions of people, including capitalists. They had rectification to get rid of counter-revolutionary nationalists in the government at all levels. They had the Korean War. And just before this, in 1958, the so-called Great Leap Forward had started. Earlier before that, there was the so-called 100 Flowers movement, where Mao said, let's encourage people to express what they think about the road to go. And then there was an overwhelming deluge of criticism. So they started the anti-rightist campaign to crack down on it. Many of China's leaders throughout the 80s and 90s, Deng Xiaoping, Zhu Rongji, all these people, most of them were imprisoned during the anti-rightist campaign because they spoke up at the wrong time. His father did not make that mistake, but because of his ties to people like Peng Dehuai, he was having some potential issues. Specifically, the year after this, 1959, there was a party conference at Lushan, in Jiangxi in the middle of China. And the very famous conference because at that conference, Peng Dehuai, the marshal who led Chinese troops in the Korean War and was the defense minister, was raising criticisms because I've gone down to the countryside and I've seen the new Great Leap Forward where we're trying to leap ahead and basically double and triple our agricultural production, but also steel production, when it was clear there was no infrastructure to support this. And he said, I'm predicting that we're going to have a horrible mess if this continues forward. Mao got wind of this, delayed the conference, and then found a way to purge, basically Peng Dehuai, and replace him with people who were more loyal. And so surely Xi Jinping would be aware of a lot of what was coming up. He was a senior leader, though, and was responsible for propaganda. He was responsible for partly the party school, and he worked under Premier Zhou Enlai, dealing with policy research and think tanks. Okay, so a very diverse set of things, but critically working with many central leaders. So here you see him actually 1961. They're probably waiting for Mao at Beijing airport. In the very middle, you see Zhou Enlai, the premier. To the right of him is Liu Shaoqi, who was then the president. Over on the left, I think, is Dong Biu, who's also a famous leader. To the back, you see He Long and Zhu De, two of the famous marshals and the leaders. And then the far right, you see Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping's father, talking to, again, Bao'erhan, one of the leader of Xinjiang in Western China. This is the calm before the storm. So this would be 1967. He's in Shanxi. Xi Jinping is being attacked by Red Guards. So Mao realized that most of the central leadership were opposed to him. They wanted kind of Soviet-style central planning. Let's build up the institutions. Let's go more gradually. Let's maybe even have some market socialist elements at the local level. Mao wanted none of that. And he felt that he was being threatened, so he encouraged young people, so-called Red Guards, mainly university students and high school students, to help him and enlist their aid. And so they went about grabbing central leaders, whenever the people they thought were opposing Mao. So Xi Jinping was natural that he would be one of these people. So he was grabbed, and the sign hanging around his neck says, Fandong Fenzi. So anti-party, an anti-party element, counter-revolutionary element. And so he spent most of the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 76, either in prison, sent down to various factories to do things. And so little Xi Jinping, right, who's only in his teens, what happens to him? Well, like a lot of other sons and daughters of these very high-ranking officials, he was sent down to the countryside. So Mao said, we need to rid, the city of all these young people, send them down to the countryside to educate the peasants. The army was totally behind this because the Red Guards are causing chaos. Literally, there's chaos in Beijing. The central government has basically shut down. And Mao has basically ceded control to people like the Gang of Four, his wife Jiang Qing and other ultra-leftist elements who they don't want any type of systematic party rule or even central government rule. They want to just have these revolutionary committees where there's like endless class struggle, including promoting the revolution abroad, say in Indonesia and other countries. And so the so-called ultra-leftists are pushing and attacking all of these old central planners, including Deng Xiaoping. And so if you're Deng Xiaoping, you flee to the south and you hide with various military people that you trained and you were part of them. Xi Jinping was lucky that he wasn't killed. Other senior leaders, including President Liu Shaoqi, were killed. Their children, many of their children, went to provinces where their parents came from, so they could hang out with family. So during this period, Xi Jinping actually is sent to an area where there's a lot of other people who have ties to that province, including many of his close personal advisors today. So a lot of his buddies actually were sent to these areas. And like a lot of them, he went back to Beijing when they thought they weren't looking. They grabbed him, put him in jail for a while, then sent him back to Shanxi. He finally, under Premier Zhou Enlai, who said, let them come back to the capital to visit their family. So here he is, smiling happily in Beijing because he's been allowed to come back and see his family. Here he is with his mother and his sisters. The father's probably in prison. So what a great family photo, right? But comparatively speaking, this is actually a good time, right? Xi Jinping, it goes back to Shanxi, but there's been a change. He's decided that he's going to play the game. And he becomes kind of the local party secretary for a very small unit. He's educated, he has political connections. The people far away from Beijing are like, hey, maybe this man will actually go somewhere. So they're happy to have him. So here he is in 1973. In 75, by this time, he's actually joined the Communist Youth League after many, many attempts and failures. He finally becomes a party member. He also takes the test to get into Tsinghua University, one of the top universities, as a Gongnongbing, right? A worker, peasant, soldier. He's not really any of those. He's actually a princeling. So it's amazing he got in. Probably family connections played a role in this. So in 75, in the fall, he's in Beijing as a freshman studying chemical engineering. And then the unthinkable happens. The beginning of your sophomore year. What's worse than the national leader dying? Huge calamitous tragedy. The average Chinese person was just filled with absolute dread. I imagine when Kim Jong-un dies in North Korea, it's going to be very similar. People will have no clue what to expect. So even people who didn't like Mao and didn't like the Cultural Revolution were incredibly fearful, okay? This would be the lineup in Tiananmen Square for the funeral. In the very middle, you can see Hua Guofeng, Mao's hand-pointed successor. Li Xianyan is next to him, the tallest guy with the glasses. And I think that's Song Qingling, the older woman who's slightly stooped, standing there. That would be the wife of President Sun Yat-sen. She stayed behind, even though her siblings went to Taiwan and became more associated with the nationalists. But behind the scenes, these are all the senior leaders. Behind the scenes, the Gang of Four is still running things. The reason we know this as well is this is the official photo. This is the official photo a year later. They've literally airbrushed them out of existence. The Gang of Four is completely gone. So the average Chinese person can see this photo, right, and can see, oh, instantly these people are just gone. Hua Guofeng is still chairman of the party, okay? But his time is limited, okay? What happened was there was a coup. Deng Xiaoping, with various marshals that he knew, including Xi Jinping, as political connections and military connections, they stage a coup, they come back. In 1977, they actually start reviving the party Congress, okay, and start bringing back the new system. They start jailing a lot of the people who were promoted, including the Gang of Four, and they start also retiring a lot of people. Many cadres in China were at retirement age. So one of the interesting things is from 78 to 82 in China, basically half of all officials retired because they were just at that age to retire. But they didn't go quietly. They didn't go unless they had extra benefits, including, in many cases, giving their job or a job like it to their children. So you have a lot of people at all levels of Chinese government from this period who started their careers when their parents retired, right about this time. So fortunes change very quickly, okay? This is Capital Airport in 1978, and Xi Jinping right there in the middle, and his sons, the younger sons next to him, but Xi Jinping is over on the left. They're seeing him off because he's been assigned to be party secretary and leader of Guangdong province in the very far south. The part that includes like Xinjiang, right across the border from Hong Kong. It's an extremely important position, both politically and even militarily. During his break, so how would you like to have this as an internship? You're studying chemical engineering, you're going down south to help dad, okay? So this really shows kind of the iconography, and all of these photos that I'm showing you, by the way, are official photos, right? So there probably are other photos, these are just the ones we see that kind of reinforce it. Xi Jinping is there in the middle. You can see he's dressed very commonly. He's got his hands behind his back, okay? It's part report, it's part listening. So he's listening to the local leaders, and right behind him is Xi Jinping imitating him, following his example. Here they are on the beach in Hainan, which is now its own province. And then there's this painting, which is definitely done much, much later. But this is supposedly Xi Jinping in the middle, talking to Deng Xiaoping on the left, and I think that's Li Shenyan next to him, another leader, talking about the creation of the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone. So one of the things that had happened during the Cultural Revolution with chaos in Beijing was that Beijing lost control of what was going on in the provinces. The provinces said, well, if Beijing isn't watching, A, we're going to keep all the taxes, and we're going to reinvest them, and we're going to start doing things, including like taking back land from communes, investing in all kinds of things, including building houses. And the thinking was, when the central government comes back, if they want to take the house away, they're going to have to bulldoze it. Similarly, in far southern China, Shenzhen's right across the border from Hong Kong. Many people have been fleeing into Hong Kong. You've also had people from Hong Kong coming into China across the border, which is fairly porous, setting up enterprises and using the cheap labor. So what basically Xi Jinping is explaining to Deng Xiaoping is, look, we've basically lost control economically of the economy in this area, which is mainly agrarian before anyway. So we can either do, I think what he probably was saying, there's two things we can do. We can either bring the army in, arrest all these people, shut it all down, try to set up a central planned economy again, or, hear me out, why don't we just tax the people? Let's get rich from what they're doing. So the genius, I would say, of Deng Xiaoping was that he recognized that decentralization had produced a lot of economic growth in Chinese localities throughout China, but including in especially the border areas. So the special economic zones is Shenzhen then was just a small fishing town or so. Now it's a giant city, all right? It's Houston's actually sister city. It's a giant port. It's also one of the leaders of technology, and many, many enterprises are based there. A lot of that has to do with decisions made by Xi Jinping, talking to Deng Xiaoping. And so 1979 must have been a good time, for the family. So Xi Jinping, basically, he graduates, from Tsinghua University. He then has a choice that I think is significant for us to consider. And that is that he can go into basically like academia, research. That's in fact what his brother did. His brother just became like a researcher within the Ministry of Defense using some family connections, has not played any significant role, but has been comfortable for the rest of his life. Xi Jinping, however, very likely talked to his father and used his political connections to become the assistant to Geng Biao. And Geng Biao was a major general who had actually previously served underneath Xi Jinping, Western China. He was also the Minister of Defense. So this is happening in 1979 as two very important things are happening. There's a war with Vietnam, okay, where Vietnam was not doing what China wanted. It was taking over the Spratly Islands, and China was worried that Vietnam was becoming much stronger. It wanted to send a message to Vietnam. As Deng Xiaoping told Jimmy Carter later on, he said, the child is becoming noisome. We need to slap it around a little bit. So they invaded. By all accounts, it was a horrible mistake. The Chinese army was routed in many cases by the Vietnamese pushed back across the border. This Xi Jinping would have saw real time from the Central Military Commission, where he was stationed, and the Ministry of Defense. Okay, so Xi Jinping saw this. It was also meant as a message to the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was being told, hey, don't mess with us. Now, China invaded, Vietnam, okay, with a significant force, but they had over 1 million soldiers mobilized on the border with the Soviet Union, because relations had very much soured with the Soviet Union by this time. The other thing that had happened was opening up to the United States. So actually, Xi Jinping, as far as I can tell, he accompanied Geng Biao, the Minister of Defense, to Washington, D.C., did a tour of many military bases all around the United States. Reportedly, there was even a special screening in October of 1982 or 81 of The Empire Strikes Back in the White House for the visiting delegation from China. So Xi Jinping is actually getting a lot of experience working in the military at the highest levels. From this point on, he has not just party roles, he also has roles in the military. As a political commissar, just like his father, just like Deng Xiaoping. This is incredibly unusual. Many of the revolutionary leaders had these types of roles, party leader, state leader, and in the military. Xi Jinping is one of the very few today who had that, and this was intentional. So he serves in the Central Military. He could have, at this point, chosen to become a pathway to become a general or an admiral, and done very, very well. His contemporaries, including people he knew, including ones from Shanxi who went into the military at this time, retired, in the last decade as generals and admirals, top military leaders. Xi Jinping could have gone that route. He did not. He went here. He went to Zhengding, kind of a poor county in Hebei. He did what is actually kind of classic and is to some degree institutionalized, which is when you're being groomed for a higher role, they send you back down, okay, to make sure you actually understand what's going on. So it could be in an urban district. In this case, it was like not a very wealthy, but still some manufacturing area, not too far from Beijing, okay, called Zhengding. And he has all the signs, of this is your local party secretary, including an office in the sun, which is important if you don't necessarily have heating in the afternoon in the north. So he has a south-facing office, critically important. He also has that kind of probably a jam jar that's been repurposed as a hot tea receptacle down there. It's a sign of like communist austerity. Okay, and resilience and, using things. So he doesn't cut the figure as a princeling. Can't see what watch he has. It could be a really good watch. That's a possibility, that might be a tip-off. Here he is. That's what his brother. On the other side, that's him with the father in the 1980s. The father has kind of played his role in Guangdong. He's brought back up to Beijing. He's a member of the Politburo, the absolute highest level of the Chinese government in the 1980s under Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang at the very highest levels of responsibility. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping, using his agricultural connections, is invited over to Iowa, where he goes and stays substantially with the Dovchak family. It's a little bit of a taste. He also goes to San Francisco, okay, that plays a little bit of the tourist, but he's getting that international experience, which was highly coveted during this time. I don't think he actually picked up much English, okay, but there's that. So then by the end of the 1980s, Another thing that's common is you're resent to another area. So he had experience in the countryside in Shanxi, then in Hebei, near Beijing. Now he's sent to the far south, Fujian. He actually spends the next 15 years in Fujian, slowly working his way up the government, but at the same time serving military roles, for various levels of the military administration as well. The 1980s for Xi Jinping should be, you could say, the highlight of his career. He's a Politburo member. One of the problems, though, is he was really tied to Hu Yaobang. And what happened in 1987, so this is 2 years before Tiananmen. This was a small demonstration in the middle of Tiananmen Square. Some of my students actually were at this demonstration. So sadly, some of my students, I didn't tell them to do this. This is not extra credit or anything like that, actually brought down Hu Yaobang. So the party secretary was Hu Yaobang. The fall of '87 is going to be the 13th Party Congress, a very, very important Congress. Hu Yaobang had allowed for a lot of experimentation with market socialism and capitalism. This was not going down well with the older opponents of this and the Soviet-style planning people amongst the senior leaders. So all it took was a small demonstration in the middle of Tiananmen, which was quickly suppressed. And I asked my students, what happened to you? They said, oh, they gave us tea and sent us home. Nobody was imprisoned. You can see it's kind of a chaotic, little scene. It's actually only like several hundred people. And the photographer very wisely brought a box so he could stand on top and you could get the protesters. And then Tiananmen Square far off in the distance. The students weren't allowed to get anywhere near it. But this was enough to bring down the party secretary, Hu Yaobang. And then 2 years later, right, in 1989, when Hu Yaobang dies, the students then use this as an excuse. They say the fact that you're not, that we're not celebrating Hu Yaobang and his death is why we're coming out into the streets. So it becomes like an excuse for a much broader protest in society. Xi Jinping was brought down by this. He and a few other central leaders were very close to Hu Yaobang, and he was just quickly pushed aside. It was made clear that you're going to have to step down as well. And this would be Xi Jinping in 1989. He's just married his lovely wife, Peng Liyuan, a very famous, in her own right, singer with the People's Liberation Army music troupe. She married her 2 years before. And you have to wonder, at this time in 1999, you have to wonder if she's going, wow, did I get on a sinking ship or a rising star, okay? Because my father-in-law has basically just been shunted aside, and there's been all this kind of chaos in Beijing earlier in the year. This is fall of 1989. Maybe I picked the wrong horse, right? That could easily have been the case. She thought that. In the 1990s, we see Xi Jinping more with the mother. The father passes away in 2002, okay, just as Xi Jinping is beginning to rise. This is the very first year where Xi Jinping is actually made a full member of the Central Committee, is in 2002, and that's when his father dies. This is his wife, Xi Jinping's mother, kind of like at a memorial thing for him several years later. But go back to the 90s, Xi Jinping is slowly rising up the ranks in Fujian. Finally, he actually, towards the end of the 90s, he's actually made an alternate to one of the 15th Party Congress. So there's like 200 members of the Central Committee. Then there's like 150 alternates. Xi Jinping's name, I believe, was listed last because he actually received the fewest votes. So probably many people were not buying it that this man would get ahead. However, 2 Party Congresses later, here he is. He's on the Politburo. Okay, so don't count this man short. He has a way of bringing things. He's actually, at this point, he's moved from Fujian to Zhejiang. He's been made, for the first time, senior party leader of a major province, one of the wealthiest provinces in China, just south of Shanghai. Then later, he's actually moved over to become party secretary of Shanghai because of a corruption scandal with the current party secretary. So Xi Jinping has enormous range of serving across all types of the economy, across the military, but in 5 different provinces and localities. That is actually classic Politburo material, okay? Because most of the members of the Politburo have served in 2 or 3, sometimes 4 different provinces. It's hard to think of an equivalent in the American case. Can you imagine cabinet secretaries who've been governors of like 3 or 4 states each? Hard to think of an equivalent. Here he is in Zhejiang doing some cooking for the poor. So basically, the propaganda in 27, 28, they're kind of setting up, yeah, this is a man who cares for the people, right? He's helping people dealing with the terrible freeze in 2008. In 2012, Hu Jintao on the left kind of passes the baton, right, to Xi Jinping on the right. And from 2012 on, right, now, of course, he's the senior leader. So now we have the photos of him as here is with sailors. Here he is meeting people with AIDS, and importantly, shaking hands with somebody with AIDS. Here he is meeting with the army. And he goes back to Iowa to catch up with buddies. Apparently, they decided to have like a small event with just the people he'd met on his previous visit. All off the record. This isn't required, I would say, to be a Chinese leader, but it doesn't help. Here he is kicking a football. This is Gaelic football, actually. Doesn't hurt if you can have some type of expertise in this. This brings us to what could possibly, have basically created any potential opposition to somebody like Xi Jinping. This guy. So this guy is Bo Xilai. And so Bo Xilai is the son of Bo Yibo. Bo Yibo is also one of the princes, a contemporary, and in fact, a higher ranked one than Xi Jinping's father. So this is another prince, but this is the alternate version. This would be like the alternate Xi Jinping, okay? And just this kind of gesture that you see, he was like the party secretary of Chongqing, one of the key central cities. Before that, he was head of a province in a city in the northeast. So he had kind of a similar pedigree, but he didn't have any military connections like Xi Jinping. He didn't serve in many different provinces. He didn't go down to the countryside and become a low-level party secretary. He didn't have any of those things. He had flash and dash, okay? And this kind of gesture that you see, you don't see Xi Jinping doing a gesture like this. And by the way, I'm pretty sure if we look at the blow up the version, that's a Ferragamo tie, okay? I think that kind of says a lot right there, right? So not surprisingly, this is serious opposition. By 2012, this man is cast in doubt. He's party secretary of Chongqing, but his police chief goes to the American consulate and because he's terrified of being executed. I'll come back to this, because his wife, Bo Xilai's wife on the left, we're actually possibly working with the son, had the son's former tutor executed, a British man. They had him murdered. The son went on to be educated at Harrow, then Oxford, and by this time, 2012, he's actually, I think, an MBA student at Harvard. Okay, so the family had a lot of wealth. Okay, on the public side, however, this was what we call, the kind of the new red. So Bo Xilai was also famous for reviving some of the great spectacle, including singing socialist songs. This is swearing in of people of party members in Chongqing in 2011. But he basically said, let's reintroduce kind of this patriotic education, including reviving a lot of these old socialist songs. And this was something that Xi Jinping has no experience with. But this is one of his competitors in doing. So he's brought down because of this scandal. Okay, his police chief flees to the consulate. Has caused an enormous scandal. Before that, he was probably tipped to move on to the Politburo. He is not. Okay, he's basically out. The problem is he is put on trial. So a Politburo member put on trial, put in prison. The problem is he had backers. Okay, so the other backer would be this guy on the left, Zhou Yongkang. Zhou Yongkang, in 2012, he's actually Minister of State Security, extremely powerful position. Before that, he was actually the party secretary for Sichuan province in Western China. Before that, he was head of CNPC. Before that, he was head of the Shengli oil field. So this is one of the petro princes who rose to the top. And we can see that because if we look at this is Zhou Yongkang's web of corruption. The very bottom is Zhou Bin, his son, who set up a company in the place where he studied, Texas. Think oil, think of corruption. Come on, there's going to be a Texas side to this, right? So Zhou Bin actually set up an enterprise in the South to kind of buy Western oil and gas equipment. I think he was mainly working with Halliburton, sell it back at outrageous prices to the Chinese oil and gas company, involving also Iraq, to try to make investments in Iraq. Anyway, this is a whole long web of lieutenants that he had installed, and he also, as part of this network, included Bo Xilai. But this person was much harder to bring down, okay, because he had networks across large state enterprise as an extremely powerful, very wealthy state enterprise in China. But on top of that, he also had ties within the intelligence network. A very hard person to bring down. Eventually, he brought him down. So Xi Jinping then, he can then assume the full mantle of power, by just 6 or 7 years ago. He goes on a world tour. Okay, after the last Party Congress, he and his wife cut quite the dashing figure. Here they are in Hamburg. We see now all the symbols. This is actually at the 60th anniversary of the founding of China, the great outsized portrait of him during the parade, meeting workers, meeting people back in Guangdong province where his father served. And then, of course, China's a spacefaring power. So visiting the space center, those are our Chinese taikonauts, version of Chinese astronauts at their space station, which will, by the way, be the new International Space Station going forward. All of our partners told us, yes, you're right, China is not a very trusty person, but then they said, yeah, let's go ahead and work with them. So the United States is probably the only power right now not going forward into the new International Space Station, which will be run by China. We're going to have to come up with our own again and see if anybody else will go along with it. These are all symbols of national pride. And so as Brandon was talking about propaganda changes, you can see, can't see all that clearly, but the upper left there, this is actually in Tibet. You can see Xi Jinping, his predecessors, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping, Mao. He's an equal. He's a par with them. Now, just because propaganda is you can direct it, you can set the stage, you can do all these grand spectacle, doesn't mean you can control all the ways that it's used. So take this innocuous, photograph, Xi Jinping, Obama, Sunnyvale, California, 2013. Think, wow, what could possibly go wrong with a wonderful photo like this, two senior statesmen strolling across the lawn? Well, this. Thank you, internet. Okay, so people instantly start putting up this comparison, right? So Xi Jinping would be Winnie the Pooh, Obama would be Tigger, okay? And this comparison's even more, this just continues. This is Shinzo Abe of Japan, who definitely, let's face it, is definitely an Eeyore, okay? Much more like Eeyore. It continues forward to this day. Carrie Lam, the former leader of Hong Kong, is compared to Piglet. And President Duterte of the Philippines, also a very sad little piglet figure. So the Hong Kong comic artist is basically kind of speculating this would be Xi Jinping's dream. This would be the China dream, would be bring me the head of Pooh Bear, Winnie the Pooh. So all that aside, the internet, all that type of criticism and satire aside, Xi Jinping is totally controlling state propaganda. By this point, we can see there he is right next to Mao in a government institution, talking about studying Lei Feng, the modelist socialist worker. This is earlier this year at an exhibition about following Xi Jinping and his thought, beautifully scripted and designed. Look at those outfits, right? These are all people getting ready to lead tour groups through the exhibition. This is at the military museum, talking about the armed forces have to basically study Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is also known for, in addition to what we call getting rid of the tigers of corruption and launching perpetual anti-corruption drive, he's also famous for cleaning up crime. So this kind of Sao-He, clean up the blackness, crime at the local level. Xi Jinping still has, even to this day, going into the Party Congress, some potential opposition. So here we see Jiang Zemin. This is the last Party Congress. Jiang Zemin, he's in his 90s now. He's still alive. Hu Jintao, his immediate successor, he's still alive. He was at the Party Congress. He's being led by somebody into the Congress, which suggests that he's signaling, intentionally or not, that he is no longer a major political player, okay? However, many of the people that Xi Jinping is currently working with were picked by these two men, okay? So if you're Xi Jinping and you want to go forward, you have to think about, how can I replace these people? There's some other voices out there. There's a very famous older senior leader named Song Ping who's over 100. And just a few weeks ago, he announced, he did something, what people say is very clever. He took a phrase from Xi Jinping from about 10 years ago saying, we need to keep deepening reform and opening up. Okay, so this is what Xi Jinping said. Now, Jinping mentions this to the press, and it's broadcast, okay, in different parts of China, and all he's doing is quoting Xi Jinping, but Xi Jinping no longer uses that phrase. Xi Jinping is no longer interested in reform. So Jinping saying this is basically widely viewed as saying, hey, we need to return back to reform. Jinping's protege was Hu Jintao. Okay, so Jinping is still alive, very active. He's at the party congress. He's 105. There's no way Xi Jinping could possibly tell him to shut up, okay? And the man found a very clever way to say, hey, Xi Jinping, maybe you should back off a little bit by using his own words against him. So that's the type of situation we are going into the party congress. I won't go through it. These are all the leaders of the Politburo going into the new party congress, Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang, his premier, and these other members. Who do you think who looks like they're the oldest person here? Who looks like they're the youngest? It's a trick question because there's only 7 years of difference between each of these 7 men. They're all born between 1950 and 1957. Li Jianshu, the far left, is actually the oldest one. One of the younger ones is Han Zheng in the back, who looks like one of the oldest ones. So basically what the Chinese politics ages you very, very quickly. And those are all people from the 50s. One thing we've also will be looking forward to, I think Carrie had alluded to this too, is how do we know that there's going to be changes in leadership and what role do the top leadership play? These are actually front pages of the main newspaper going back to 1977. So that is the 11th Party Congress in the upper left. That's Mao's successor, Chairman Hua, and the members of the Politburo beneath him. These are all the other Politburos leading up to 2012, right? Xi Jinping has the transfer of power. 2017, the last time, I'll come back, we had this. So he's taking up so much more of the page. And the other Politburo members, yeah, they're there, but you can't really see them. This was actually replicated in Hunan. There's another version, the same company owns a more commercial version, kind of like a tabloid that commuters would carry with them. The commuter version on the right doesn't even bother putting up the other Politburos. They're just kind of telling people, hey, if you're involved in business, everyday affairs, just follow Xi Jinping. You can't go wrong. That's basically so. Xi Jinping has, he's done a lot of the things that you would think of as the senior statesman. This is last year, visiting minority areas in the South, and doing things like this. We're getting more poses, again, the inspection pose, right? But in the cloud, in the mist. To most Chinese people, this can also evoke this. So this is Chairman Mao in 1961. After he's won, he's purged the Politburo of his enemies. After this, however, is not necessarily a happy story even for Mao. Mao begins to slowly lose control. Probably he had Parkinson's and some other issues as well. But from this point on, Mao begins to kind of slowly lose control of the party to the radicals, and eventually his legacy is also tarnished by it. And so the question is Xi Jinping moving from this? Is he going to stay the chief inspector, the people or is he going to become more like this, leaning back, posed as a solitary figure who exists in and of himself, not just communicating with the people? I would say just very quickly, I'm going to go through and just mention that some of the things I think we're going to see going forward is fewer political campaigns, but within the party, increased political campaigns. A party loyalty is valued above all else. Party members are not supposed to have ties to any other type of organization, not even supposed to be like members of alumni associations. He's getting rid of old cliques. My research assistants have been helping me look at members of the Central Committee and what they belong to. Up until 2012, we wrote a report talking about how there was a very strong energy clique, oil and gas companies, all versions of the oil industry, throughout the Central Committee and even at the Politburo level. What's very striking is the last Central Committee, the one that's still existing until the end of this week, almost no oil and gas people. Okay, Xi Jinping is getting rid of the old state enterprise cliques and the old senior leaders. He's appointing more and more bureaucrats. So I would call this the rise of the red technocrats. And he's also not happy with oligarchs. So the famously Huawei and the Huawei company's daughter, was grabbed in Canada. It caused a huge scandal back and forth. Chinese people were rejoicing that she was returned to China. China let go the 2 diplomats that had basically had it seized as former diplomats that seized as hostages. But I would imagine that Xi Jinping is not happy at all with the leaders of Huawei or any of the other types of people. He does not want people like oligarchs. And in that sense, it's much like Putin and Khodorkovsky. We need to get rid of these people who are potential sources. So he's not including them in the Central Committee or in the leadership. So I would say the phrase to keep in mind is the one that's kind of brought back and embellished, which is 从站起来, 富起来, 到强起来, which is that we're moving from standing up. So basically, this standing up is basically the anthem of the Chinese nation. We've liberated, we've gotten rid of the foreigners, then we become rich, now we need to become strong. So basically, he's saying this explains the movement towards nationalism, the strengthening of the military, and part of COVID response, but also, I would say, the so-called one country, two systems approach that Hong Kong had basically been thriving under and was meant to persuade Taiwan. It's gone. Okay, there won't be any real discussion. Nobody in Taiwan's really buying it these days, not even the nationalists. Okay, I went on far too long, but just to thank my research assistants for helping me with all of this. And I'd like to ask, actually, my colleagues to join me, and we can answer some questions. Yeah, I went a lot longer. Okay, that's kind of, I would say, please. Not Fidel Castro long, but still long. So maybe if we have time for a few questions, and then we can stand outside and chat more informally. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
I was curious how you thought the history of Xi Jinping would lead to the way he's going to solve his current set of problems. Like, I mean, they're pretty well enumerated in terms of real estate and debt and COVID response, and just, I mean, it seemed like a litany of problems that any one of them could cause, I don't know, the people to be upset.
Yeah. I think you're the natural person. I can add in something too, but if we're talking about protests and what the people think, maybe you could start us off.
Well, I think, so asking about how his background then relates to, the...
How does that help predict what we can expect in, I don't know, the next 2 to 6 months?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just looking at how there's a strengthening of the state, right? So looking at how his background and his elimination of rivals and his consolidation of power indicates that it's clear that he does not want to take any threats to that in particular. The kinds of movements, if we look at whether it's environmental, labor, those aren't real threats to the state because they're not attacking the state anymore. We're not looking at state-owned enterprises. We're not looking at some kind of those fundamental components. It's the other areas where, whether it's minority politics or some of those other challenges, so whether you're looking at the Uyghurs and how that challenges state authority, that you might see a more aggressive kind of approach. But I think it's more a matter of how he's strengthened himself as the center of the party and the state. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But I think also just the only thing I could add to that, he's not going to back down. This is somebody who does not seem to understand moving backwards. And maybe by his way of thinking, he probably thinks he knows everything already. He's one of the very few people who served in all these different capacities and all these different roles. And the only thing he hasn't had experience in was like leading a state enterprise or in business. But he probably just figures, well, we can let entrepreneurs do that under our direction. But to me, that it doesn't sound like he's interested in backing down on COVID policy, the zero COVID policy, or it's going to be more of the same going forward. I think if you're asking about the economic side in particular, we'll be looking to see who are the people he's picking, to be on who are leading the kind of leadership on that.
Economic forecasting in China has to do with how healthy their economy is going to be. And I think that one insightful observation that you made around one of the leaders realizing that they could accept some change just as long as they taxed it, which if you got 1.5 billion people and you have a tax rate of 35%, you can kind of see how they have a hell of a lot of money, So will he screw that up, or will he try to energize that?
Great question. Yeah.
About the economic thing. For a long time, China had this trade-off as people, right? I mean, let us handle politics and we make you rich. But now, with the last couple of years, we've seen a big shift. With Alibaba's founder, Jack Ma, being in prison and no longer in public eye, a lot of clampdown on multi-billion-dollar companies, $1 trillion being wiped off, valuation of Alibaba and other company Trisent. We're seeing major problems in the real estate market with bankruptcies and people refusing to pay mortgages and rent payments. It's leading to major underpinning shocks to the system, right? So how do you see this causing major instability to the country?
Do you see major instability?
Well, I think, China scholars have always said the key to keeping China as it is economic growth and development. I think I alluded to that as well. And so as long as you can keep the economy successful, then you can basically keep people without political ideas, right? So you don't bite the hand that feeds you. And so there's a lot of challenges now because of the way that the economy has suffered, particularly under these COVID lockdowns. And I think that's where we see a lot more of the potential for criticism. It's not enough to destabilize things. I think at the very least, there are ways that you can use the massive propaganda machine to kind of reinstitute us that things are getting better. And so even if you look at the message that has been out for a while, right? The idea is that, eventually those trickle-down economics will get to you, and we look at it, there's still a lot of people that are losing out under economic reform. And so it really is about controlling the message more and using various smoke and mirrors to get people to think that the economy is doing well. It's not bad. If you look at the latest estimate, so in the 20th party, in the speech, he mentioned that the expectation would be 5.5% growth. Now, 5.5% growth, if we saw 5.5% growth, we'd be ecstatic, right? But 5.5% growth, probably a bit optimistic, more probably like 2.5%, 3%. But again, this is no surprise that we've seen these messages before. If you look at the early stages of economic reform, 18% growth, 21% growth, right? A bit exaggerated. So I really do think it's part of that messaging to make sure that there is enough belief that the economy is doing okay overall and that China is continuing to prosper that is a key part of keeping legitimacy for the party as much as it is for Xi Jinping. Because if they can't deliver on the economic component of it, China's not really a communist state in terms of thinking about the ideology driving the state. And so as a result, you have to have something that gives people a sense that everything works. And that's what the economy does. It shows that things are working overall. And so it's a really key part of keeping people happy.
I think kind of building on that, but also getting your question, what will they be able to do, to try to keep the economy going, to keep the people happy? One of the obvious things I think that will happen maybe after our elections, right, next month, and after the Party Congress, now there's actually more of an incentive for the United States and Chinese governments to get together and reduce the trade war. There's obvious things. President Biden has taken a very strident chance on chips, things of very strategic importance, and that will hit China hard. But probably in very unpredictable ways. But there's an enormous number of things that the American people are still buying from China. And it would also help inflation on this end to not have these, right? And it would also help China. And so I think that's an obvious. And China has been very kind of strident, in the run up to the Party Congress and basically telling Blinken and our trade representatives saying, yeah, being kind of almost like shouting at them across the table. My suspicion is that the incentive for that to continue will go down after our elections and after the Party Congress. And so maybe they will be discussing about that. Meanwhile, the greater game, though, is that China doesn't want to feel isolated, in this way. And it's going to be very hard for them to replace the role that Hong Kong has played. That was where all the angel investors from the United States and, hedge funds and things would go through Hong Kong. To do that, and they've kind of killed, I would say, the golden goose, the goose that lays the golden eggs by disrupting Hong Kong. They think that Shenzhen can replace Hong Kong, but Shenzhen doesn't have Hong Kong's legal system. And so I really don't see that as playing the role. The Chinese government is very, very good at taking good technology, that's created by private entrepreneurs and developers and its own research and development. It spends an enormous amount as a percentage of GDP more than the United States, almost as much as Singapore, on research and design, but is very bad at moving it from angel investors into startups. The Chinese government is very good at taking it from startups and moving it over to large enterprises and scaling up, monitoring and expanding it around the world and using their connections to make that happen. But it's going to be rough going for their economy to try to adapt to that going forward. Maybe a couple more questions? Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much. 3 fascinating presentations giving a lot of insight, a little bit hard to absorb. Let me turn it to a more present day situation. Henry Kissinger, who is all 99 years old, and he was majorly involved in opening China, in September said we are in a new Cold War. How is China looking at this situation? And if I may add, how is China or Xi looking at Putin?
You want to go first or should I go first?
Go ahead.
All right. I would say Xi Jinping probably naturally doesn't like somebody like Putin. In this end, I would say more because I think he probably sees Putin as, just like his former opponents, enormously corrupt. So China has been forced to bring in more oil and more gas from Russia, mainly so they don't have to bring as much in from the Middle East, which is guaranteed by the American Navy. They do not want to be dependent on that. So they need to bring in as much as possible from land routes, including Russia, and Russia is very unstable, unreliable, but they're willing to do it, including paying money to Putin's lieutenants and his corrupt construction practices. They'll do it because they actually don't have another choice. And I would say they're also worried about them because Russia has been propping up governments in Kazakhstan, and the other stan. So all of these neighbors that China is also getting oil and gas from, and are also, by the way, straddling the roadway that goes all the way to Europe. The railways that carry all their goods, to Europe. That's also viewed as a potential threat to China. But China at this time probably feels they need him. And they probably also feel this is actually a good partner to have if you're opposing the United States. So they won't use the word Cold War. They'll continue to play, as long as they think it's believed, the globalist card, right? I don't think it's nobody's buying it in Europe, or in Japan or many of the other, advanced economies. But other parts of the world, developing economies, China still has a good reputation, in some countries around the world. And some countries are using Chinese currency, and more than they're using dollars. So there's some of these countries, and China is still hoping to replace the United States at some point in this way. Did you want to add anything?
Well, I would say in some ways, the idea of a new Cold War is kind of there because we've created it, right? So the idea that China is the enemy that the United States needs to, try to punish in some way, and the Chinese looking at the United States in terms of being a hegemon and trying to identify themselves as never wanting to seek hegemony. So the idea of having this Cold War kind of mentality in place where you have these two rivals that are looking at each other as real competitors, I think really has come to play because Russia's been a little bit less important in some ways. Now, of course, they're important now in terms of what we're looking at them in the global realm, but looking at the competition, economic competition, military competition, it's been this continual emphasis on watching China and trying to contain China and trying to focus on that element that's created this whole idea of a Cold War. And so I think that part's definitely there. And even in the speech from this last weekend, concerns about U.S. hegemony and worried about national security and looking at U.S. interests in the South China Sea or with Taiwan, these are all just different elements of looking at the strategic rivalry between the United States and China. And so the idea is at least there in our media to help get us interested in what's going on or, to keep us focused on it. And so I think that's something to be concerned about at least.
Also, if I can just add one quick statement, a lot of Russia, as my colleagues sort of alluded to, a lot of the partnership between Russia and China is very pragmatic. they might not say that because, of course, they can't just say it's pragmatic, like, right? It's sort of like we couldn't say it regarding NATO, right? Like, yeah, France left NATO's command because they were mad about us keeping nuclear installations in their country. We're not going to say that in public. So there is some amount of, foreign diplomatic rhetoric. But as far as Russia goes, it will always be important because it is, the world's gas station with nukes. So you can't ignore it. But, in the day-to-day operations, when the nukes aren't necessarily the immediate worry, they're working together for pragmatic reasons, but yeah, Xi was going around all the provinces doing things, and Putin was essentially like a KGB officer being, I think, the lackey for like the mayor of Kaliningrad, isn't it? Oh, St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg, Sobchak.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Very different backgrounds. Yeah. Well, anyway, on that note, it's actually just somehow occurred to me, we actually have food for you, which I don't want to be getting cold. Why don't we all go move it outside and enjoy some food and talk over that? But thank you very much for coming. And thank you for your questions and comments, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you for having us.
Sure.
So, you were